The Pacific Ocean is vast beyond imagination. Its waters stretch thousands of miles in every direction, broken only by scattered islands and lonely atolls. To many, these places were distant and unimportant, small specks of land in an endless sea. But in the early 1942s, the Pacific became the most contested battlefield on Earth. Nations fought not only for territory but for survival, and even the smallest islands would take on enormous significance. The road to Midway began months before the battle itself, in an explosion of fire and smoke at Pearl Harbor. On the quiet Sunday morning of the 7th of December 1941, Japanese aircraft roared over the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Within minutes, torpedoes and bombs were tearing into the anchored ships of the United States Pacific Fleet. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. Battleships moored side by side became twisted ruins. The Arizona exploded so violently that her wreck still lies at the bottom today, a tomb for over 1,000 men. The Oklahoma rolled over, trapping sailors inside as water rushed in. In 2 hours of destruction, more than 2,000 Americans were killed, and the Pacific Fleet appeared broken. For Japan, the attack was celebrated as a stunning victory. Years of planning and training had paid off. They had struck a blow that they hoped would cripple the United States before it could fully enter the war. For America, however, it was a deep wound and a shock that reverberated far beyond the Pacific. President Franklin Roosevelt called it a day of infamy, and within hours, the United States declared war. The isolationist mood that had dominated American politics for so long vanished in an instant. The war in Europe and Asia had suddenly become America's war as well. Yet, even amidst the devastation at Pearl Harbor, something remarkable had happened. The carriers of the Pacific Fleet, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga, were not in port that morning. By pure chance, they had escaped destruction. These ships, which once played a supporting role to the mighty battleships, were now the only major striking force America had left in the Pacific. No one could know it at the time, but the survival of those carriers would change the entire course of the war. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, Japan's advance across Asia and the Pacific seemed unstoppable. Their armies and fleets struck in every direction at once. Wake Island, defended heroically by a small garrison of Marines, fell under overwhelming assault. Guam was taken. The Philippines, though defended with courage at Bataan and Corregidor, were eventually forced to surrender after months of siege and suffering. Hong Kong fell to Japanese troops. Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies were invaded. Everywhere the Japanese attacked, they brought swift victory. In only a few months, Japan had created a vast empire, stretching from the Asian mainland across Southeast Asia and deep into the Pacific Ocean. With each conquest, they gained vital resources: oil, rubber, tin, and other materials that would fuel their war machine. But more than that, they gained confidence. To Japanese leaders, it seemed the time had come to expand the empire even further, pushing the boundaries of their power until no enemy could challenge them. For the Americans, the picture looked grim. The Pacific Fleet had been dealt a terrible blow. Their battleships were gone, their bases threatened, and their forces in the Philippines had been lost. But America still had something that Japan could not easily overcome: industry, resources, and an unshakable determination. Already, shipyards and factories on the American mainland were turning out new warships and aircraft at a speed Japan could never match. And across the nation, ordinary men and women were enlisting, training, and preparing for a long fight ahead. Even so, in the spring of 1942, the situation was fragile. The Japanese Navy still held the initiative. Their carrier forces had won victory after victory, from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. Their pilots were experienced, disciplined, and confident. The Zero fighter, fast and agile, dominated the skies. Their ships seemed invincible, their commanders sure of themselves. For the moment, the Pacific belonged to Japan. It was in this atmosphere of Japanese triumph and American uncertainty that the next stage of the war began to take shape. The Japanese High Command believed that to secure their empire, they needed to eliminate the American carriers. Without them, the United States would be powerless in the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, crafted an elaborate plan. His idea was to lure the American carriers into a trap, to strike them down in one decisive battle that would leave Japan unchallenged. The place he chose for this confrontation was a small atoll called Midway, a remote island halfway between Asia and North America. At first glance, Midway was insignificant, just a pair of tiny islands surrounded by coral reefs and ocean, but its location made it vital. From Midway, planes could reach deep into the Pacific. For Japan, seizing it would bring them closer to Hawaii and threaten the American mainland. For the United States, losing it would push the enemy one step nearer to their own shores. The coming battle would not be just another clash at sea. It would be a turning point, a contest not only of ships and planes, but of intelligence, strategy, and human courage. The Japanese sought to crush their enemy in a single blow, while the Americans, battered but determined, prepared to gamble everything they had to hold the line. The Pacific, calm on its surface, was about to erupt once again in fire and fury. The fate of nations would hang in the balance, and on the coral sands of Midway, history would take a new course. The road to Midway was not a straight one. It was paved with victories and defeats, decisions and gambles, all born out of the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor. In December of 1941, the United States found itself hurled suddenly and violently into a global war. The strike on Hawaii had shocked the nation. People who had once debated whether America should even join the fight now watched as their cities prepared for blackouts, as young men lined up outside recruiting stations, and as factories began working day and night to produce the ships and planes that would be needed. The country was wounded, but it was also galvanized. The Japanese had expected hesitation. What they got was determination. Still, in those early months, America was on the defensive. The Philippines were falling, their defenders pushed into the Bataan Peninsula, suffering from hunger and disease. Corregidor, the island fortress at the mouth of Manila Bay, resisted fiercely, but even that stronghold would eventually be forced to surrender. Thousands of American and Filipino soldiers became prisoners of war, enduring the brutal march northward that history would remember as the Bataan Death March. In Southeast Asia, Japan's forces seemed unstoppable. Malaya and Singapore had fallen. Burma was collapsing. The Dutch East Indies were being seized, island by island, their oil fields swallowed up to fuel Japan's expanding empire. At sea, too, Japan seemed untouchable. Their carrier forces roamed the Pacific with confidence. The Imperial Navy had perfected the art of the carrier strike. Fast, coordinated attacks, with waves of bombers and torpedo planes guided by nimble Zero fighters. Wherever they struck, they inflicted damage. In April 1942, Japanese carriers swept into the Indian Ocean, striking at British bases in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. They sank ships, destroyed planes, and forced the British fleet to retreat westward. For a moment, it seemed that no navy in the world could stand against them. But America had one advantage, and it was one that Japan had overlooked. The American carriers that had escaped destruction at Tay-Day, Pearl Harbor, were still afloat, and their crews were learning quickly how to use them. The battleships that once formed the backbone of the fleet were gone, and so the carriers were forced into the role of main strike force. This was new, untested, and dangerous. No one had ever fought a war at sea entirely with carriers before. But the United States had no choice. They had to adapt, and fast. By early 1942, the first glimmers of resistance appeared. American carriers began to launch small raids on Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. They struck the Marshall Islands, the Gilbert Islands, and Wake. These raids were limited in effect, but they carried enormous symbolic weight. They told the sailors and pilots of the U.S. Navy that they could strike back. They told the Japanese that their empire was not untouchable. Each raid gave American crews badly needed combat experience. and each one tested the tactics of carrier warfare that would soon be used on a much larger scale. Then came an audacious plan that would shake Japan's confidence to its core. In April of 1942, only months after Pearl Harbor, the United States launched the Doolittle Raid. It was a daring mission, unlike anything attempted before. 16 Army bombers, long-range B-25 seconds, were loaded onto the deck of the carrier Hornet. These were not planes designed for carrier operations, but there was no other way to bring them within range of Japan itself. On April 18, the bombers took off from the Hornet's deck, skimming low over the waves before rising toward the Japanese homeland. Their target was Tokyo. The bombs that fell on the Japanese capital that day caused little physical damage. The factories still stood, the infrastructure was barely touched, but the psychological effect was enormous. For the first time, the Japanese people realized that the war could touch their own soil. They had been promised by their leaders that Japan itself would remain safe, that the empire's perimeter would keep the enemy far away. But now, smoke rose over Tokyo, and panic rippled through the population. Even more than the damage itself, it was the humiliation that cut deep. The emperor had been placed at risk. Japan's leaders were shaken. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and the architect of Pearl Harbor, took the Doolittle Raid personally. His honor and the honor of the Navy had been stained. He was already considering a plan to draw the Americans into a decisive battle, but now that plan became urgent. Japan's empire stretched wide, but it was also vulnerable. The United States could not be allowed to strike again at its heart. Yamamoto believed that only by smashing the American carriers once and for all could Japan secure its position. The bait he chose was Midway. But before Midway, there was another clash to come. In May of 1942, the two great carrier navies met for the first time in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japan had planned to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea, a move that would threaten Australia and cut it off from the United States. To cover the invasion, Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku sailed into the Coral Sea. Waiting for them was an American force, led by the carriers Lexington and Yorktown. The battle that followed was unlike anything seen before. The two fleets never sighted each other directly. Instead, waves of planes searched the sea, found their targets, and struck. Aircraft clashed high above the water, while ships maneuvered desperately to avoid incoming torpedoes and bombs. On May 7 and 8, 1942, the balance of power hung in the air above those waters. The Japanese lost the small carrier Shoho and saw Shokaku battered so badly she would need months of repairs. Zuikaku's air groups were shredded, her pilots dead or exhausted. The Americans, meanwhile, lost the great carrier Lexington, blown apart by fires after repeated bomb and torpedo strikes. Yorktown was damaged, limping back to port with holes in her decks, and her crew exhausted. On the surface, the Japanese could claim victory. They had sunk a fleet carrier while losing only a light one. But the truth was different. The invasion of Port Moresby had been turned back. Australia remained safe, and for the first time, Japanese expansion had been stopped. More importantly, Japan's carrier forces were no longer invincible. They had been bloodied, and though America's losses were painful, the battle showed that the Imperial Navy could be matched. The Coral Sea was a prelude, a rehearsal for what was to come. Both sides learned valuable lessons. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, were now the decisive weapon. Air power ruled the seas. Radar, damage control, and quick decision-making mattered more than sheer numbers. And above all, battles could be decided by information, by who knew the enemy's position first, by who struck first. When Yorktown limped back into Pearl Harbor, her decks scarred and her systems failing, Admiral Chester Nimitz faced a terrible choice. Intelligence reports told him that Japan was preparing for a major operation aimed at a place codenamed AF. Thanks to American codebreakers, Nimitz knew what AF meant, Midway. He also knew that the Japanese were planning to strike in early June. He had only weeks to prepare, and his fleet was battered. But Nimitz made a decision that would define the course of the war. Yorktown, though her damage looked catastrophic, would be repaired in record time. In just 3 days, workers swarmed over the ship, patching holes, repairing elevators, welding, hammering, working around the clock. By the end of it, Yorktown was not fully restored, but she was seaworthy and she could fight again. America had 3 carriers ready: Enterprise, Hornet, and the patched-up Yorktown. Against them, Japan would bring 4 of their finest: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all veterans of Pearl Harbor. On paper, the odds were grim, but the Americans had something more powerful than numbers. They had knowledge. They knew where and when the Japanese would strike. The road from Pearl Harbor had been long and painful. From the ruins of December 7, through the desperate defenses of Bataan, the humiliation of losing the Philippines, and the narrow, bloody fight of the Coral Sea, the United States had endured. Each battle was a test, each defeat a lesson. And now, at the turning of spring to summer in 1942, the 2 great carrier navies were about to meet again, not in the shadows of uncertainty, but in a battle that both knew could decide the entire war in the Pacific. The road led across a vast ocean, to a lonely atoll of coral and sand, to Midway. The Empire of Japan, at the beginning of 1942, stood at its greatest height. In the space of only a few months, its armies and navies had expanded their dominion across Asia and the Pacific. They had humbled Western colonial powers, seized resource-rich territories, and struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. Yet even at this moment of triumph, the Japanese high command was divided. Some believed that Japan had already achieved more than enough. The vital resources of Southeast Asia, especially oil, rubber, and tin, were now in their possession. With careful defense and determined resistance, they argued, Japan could consolidate its empire and force the United States and Britain to accept a negotiated peace. Why push further, when so much had already been gained? Why risk all that had been won with reckless moves? But there was another voice. It was the voice of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, a man whose influence carried the weight of both brilliance and determination. Yamamoto had studied in the United States. He had lived in Harvard, traveled its cities, observed its industry, and understood its people. More than most of his contemporaries, he knew the strength of America, its vast industrial capacity, its endless resources, and its fierce spirit once aroused. He had warned his leaders before Pearl Harbor that war with America would not be short. He had said that for 6 months, perhaps a year, Japan might win victory after victory. But beyond that, he feared, the balance would shift. America's shipyards, its factories, its workshops, would awaken. And when they did, the tide of war would turn against Japan. So, Yamamoto argued that Japan must strike again. It must not only defend its conquests, but it must also deliver a decisive blow, one so crushing, so complete, that the Americans would lose the will to fight. He believed that only by destroying the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single climactic battle could Japan secure its new empire and force America to the negotiating table. It was an audacious vision, rooted in a centuries-old Japanese naval doctrine called Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. In Yamamoto's mind, the place for this battle would be Midway. Midway Atoll was a tiny, remote outpost in the Central Pacific. A speck on the map, halfway between Asia and North America, it seemed insignificant. Yet it was far from meaningless. The atoll possessed an airstrip and a garrison. More importantly, its location made it a gatekeeper of sorts. Whoever controlled Midway could threaten Hawaii, and from Hawaii, the entire American Pacific coast. If Midway fell, Pearl Harbor itself would be exposed. Yamamoto's plan was complex, perhaps overly so. He envisioned a grand operation, involving multiple fleets, multiple diversionary strikes, and the coordination of hundreds of ships across thousands of miles of ocean. The heart of the plan was simple: lure the American carriers into battle and destroy them. To do this, he would launch an attack on Midway, bomb its airfields, land an invasion force, and provoke the Americans into responding. At the same time, other Japanese forces would strike at the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, creating a diversion to split American strength. While the Americans rushed to defend both fronts, Yamamoto's carriers would ambush and annihilate them. It was bold, it was grand, it was also flawed. The Japanese underestimated the Americans' capacity for resilience. They assumed that after Pearl Harbor and the loss of so much territory, America's spirit was broken. They assumed that the United States Navy would react predictably, charging to defend Midway and falling into their trap. They assumed, above all, that their plan would remain secret. But here, fate and skill intervened. Unknown to Yamamoto, American intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor had been listening. In cramped, dimly lit rooms, codebreakers worked tirelessly to decipher Japanese communications. Led by men like Commander Joseph Rochefort, they slowly unraveled the complex cipher used by the Japanese Navy. Piece by piece, word by word, they discovered that a major operation was coming. The Japanese referred to their target as AF. At first, there was uncertainty about what AF meant, but the Americans devised a clever ruse. Midway had no natural source of fresh water, so they sent a false radio message, claiming that Midway's water supply had broken down. Shortly afterward, Japanese communications reported that AF is short of water. The ruse had worked. AF was Midway. Now, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, knew where Yamamoto planned to strike. Armed with this knowledge, he devised his own plan. It was daring, for his resources were still limited. The United States had only 3 carriers available: the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the damaged but hastily repaired Yorktown. Against Yamamoto's 4 powerful carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the Americans seemed outmatched. But Nimitz had one great advantage: surprise. He would not be lured. Instead, he would lie in wait, setting his own trap for the Japanese. The stage was set. Across the vast Pacific, fleets began to move. From Japan, Yamamoto's armada, one of the besieged, largest ever assembled, surged eastward. From Pearl Harbor, Nimitz's carriers slipped quietly into the sea, their crews tense, their decks stacked with aircraft. Between them lay Midway, that tiny atoll of sand, coral, and seabirds, soon to be the focal point of history. And so, as spring turned to summer in 1942, both sides prepared. For the Japanese, it was a chance to secure their empire and perhaps end the war before American industry could awaken. For the Americans, it was a desperate gamble, a chance to halt Japan's advance, to strike back, and to change the course of the Pacific War. The men who sailed into those waters, whether American or Japanese, did not know what fate awaited them. Many were young, barely out of school, suddenly thrust into a conflict that spanned oceans. Pilots who had trained for months would soon test themselves in fire. Sailors who had never seen battle would soon feel the deck shake beneath them as bombs exploded. Commanders who had studied strategy would soon make decisions in minutes that could alter the destiny of nations. Midway, that small atoll, was about to become the stage for one of the most decisive battles in naval history. And as both fleets closed in, carried forward by the winds and tides of war, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. In a quiet building at Pearl Harbor, far from the roar of engines and the crash of waves, a different kind of battle was being fought. It was not a battle of guns and torpedoes, but of symbols, scraps of intercepted messages, and the patience of men who stared at endless strings of numbers and letters. This was the war of the code breakers, and their victory would prove as decisive as any fleet or squadron in the vast Pacific. The Japanese Navy believed their communications were secure. They relied on a complex code system, one that combined thousands of characters into sequences that seemed impenetrable. Messages were encrypted, sent over radio, and then received by complex commanders across the Pacific. To the Japanese, Their code was an iron wall, unbreakable by any enemy. But walls, no matter how strong, have cracks, and in those cracks, the Americans found opportunity. At the heart of the American effort was Station Hypo, the Navy's code-breaking unit housed in Pearl Harbor. Its leader, Commander Joseph Rochefort, was an unusual figure. He often worked in slippers and a bathrobe, surviving on endless cups of coffee, his desk piled high with intercepted radio traffic. He was brilliant, eccentric, and relentless. With his team of linguists, mathematicians, and cryptanalysts, he devoted himself to breaking the Japanese code known as JN-25. The work was exhausting, tedious, and uncertain. Day after day, the team sifted through fragments of messages, trying to spot patterns, repeated groups of numbers, or words that might reveal their meaning. It was like piecing together a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. But slowly, painfully, progress was made. By early 1942, Rochefort's team could read portions of Japanese naval traffic. Not everything, not always, but enough to glimpse plans and intentions. It was through this painstaking work that they first saw references to a place called AF. The Japanese were planning something large, and AF was at the center of it. But what was AF? Some suspected it might be Midway. Others thought it could be another base, perhaps in the South Pacific. Without certainty, Admiral Nimitz could not gamble his already thin resources. The Americans needed proof, so Rochefort devised a clever ruse. Midway, he knew, had no natural source of fresh water. The garrison relied entirely on shipments and condensers. With Nimitz's approval, a false message was sent from Midway itself, in plain text, reporting that the island's water plant had broken down and that supplies were running low. The Japanese took the bait. Within hours, their coded communications reported that AF is short of water. The mystery was solved. AF was indeed Midway. That confirmation changed everything. Now the Americans knew exactly where Yamamoto intended to strike. And more than that, by intercepting further messages, Rochefort's team could estimate when. Between the 4th and 6th of June, the Japanese carriers would approach Midway, launching their attack. The Americans had their chance to prepare. Yet even with this knowledge, doubts lingered. Some in Washington questioned Rochefort's findings. They worried that committing the fleet to defend Midway might expose it to disaster. After all, the Japanese were still formidable, their navy vast, their pilots experienced. But Admiral Nimitz trusted his codebreakers. He understood that this was perhaps the only opportunity to meet the Japanese on something like equal terms. With America's limited strength, he could not fight everywhere. But at Midway, armed with intelligence, he could lay a trap. The trap required secrecy and speed. Nimitz had only 3 carriers available: the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown. The Yorktown, damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, was barely seaworthy. Shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor were told they had 3 months to repair her. They finished in 3 days. Crews worked around the clock, welding, hammering, and patching. The Yorktown sailed out of harbor, still carrying repair teams aboard. Her scars hastily covered, her deck still smelling of fresh paint. It was a miracle of effort, born of desperation. Meanwhile, Nimitz issued his orders. Task Force 16, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, would sail with the Enterprise and Hornet. Task Force 17, under Admiral Frank Fletcher, would take the Yorktown. Together, they would wait northeast of Midway, hidden in the empty ocean. When Yamamoto's carriers appeared, the Americans would strike first. It was a bold plan, but it depended entirely on timing, secrecy, and the fragile thread of code-breaking intelligence. The men of Station Hypo knew this. They worked without rest, monitoring Japanese transmissions, refining their estimates, feeding information to Nimitz. They were invisible soldiers in the coming battle, their weapons not bombs or shells but pencils, papers, and typewriters. And yet, without them, the Battle of Midway could never have been fought, let alone won. On Midway itself, preparations were also underway. The small garrison of Marines dug in, strengthening defenses. Airstrips were patched, aircraft dispersed, anti-aircraft guns loaded and tested. Reinforcements arrived, B-17, flying fortresses from Hawaii, torpedo bombers, marine fighters. The island, normally quiet except for the cries of seabirds, now hummed with activity. Men slept little, knowing that soon the Japanese would come. And so the stage was set, though neither side could yet see the other. For Yamamoto, the operation seemed flawless. His fleet, the largest concentration of naval power ever assembled, was already at sea. 4 great carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, sailed with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, an armada stretching across miles of ocean. To him, the Americans would be lured into a trap, their last carriers destroyed, their Pacific fleet crippled beyond repair. To him, it was the decisive blow that would end the war in Japan's favor. But Yamamoto did not know that his plans were already known. He did not know that Nimitz had moved his carriers into position. He did not know that the Americans, though fewer in number, would be waiting. The secrecy of the code-breakers had held. Their quiet war of numbers and words, waged in dusty rooms far from the sea, had turned the tide before a single bomb was dropped. As May faded into June, tension grew. Every intercepted message confirmed the timeline. Every scrap of intelligence pointed toward Midway. Rochefort and his team grew haggard, their eyes red from sleepless nights, but they pressed on, knowing that the fate of fleets and nations rested on their work. Nimitz read their reports, weighing risks, trusting in their accuracy. Spruance and Fletcher readied their ships, their crews, their pilots. The ocean, vast and indifferent, rolled on. To the thousands of men scattered across ships and islands, it seemed calm, almost deceptively so. But beneath that calm, events were converging. A secret war of codes had laid the foundation. Soon, the real battle would begin. The code-breakers had done their part. Now, the fate of the Pacific would rest in the hands of sailors, pilots, and commanders. The quiet rooms of Station Hypo faded into the background, their contribution unseen by most, but never forgotten by history. Without them, there could have been no victory at Midway. With them, the tide of war was about to turn. The days leading into June of 1942 were unlike any others in the Pacific War. For months, the Japanese Empire had surged forward, expanding its reach with a speed that stunned the world, but now, the momentum of conquest was about to meet its first great test. Across the ocean, in shipyards, airstrips, and command rooms, men on both sides prepared for a battle that none of them could quite imagine, yet all of them sensed would be decisive. The ocean was vast, indifferent, and empty to the human eye, but upon its surface, fleets were assembling, carriers were being fueled and armed, and young men were waiting for their moment to enter into history. For the Japanese, the operation was set in motion long before the first ship raised anchor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind of the plan, believed he was orchestrating a grand trap that would finally cripple American sea power. He had convinced his superiors that Midway Atoll, a remote speck of coral and sand, should be the bait. He imagined the Americans would rush to defend it, committing their last remaining carriers, and then be overwhelmed by the might of the combined fleet. The operation was to unfold with the precision of a well-played game of chess, each piece moving into place across thousands of miles of ocean. On May 27th, the Japanese carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo slipped quietly out of Hashirajima. The pride of the fleet moved with it. Akagi, the flagship, a ship born from the hull of a battlecruiser, but now one of the most powerful carriers in the world. Alongside her steamed Kaga, her decks long and wide after a major refit, Soryu and Hiryu followed, smaller but no less dangerous, each carrying squadrons of skilled, battle-hardened aviators. With them came fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, forming a screen of steel and firepower that stretched across the water. The heart of Japan's naval might was now at sea, pointed toward Midway. Trailing behind by several hundred miles was Yamamoto himself, aboard his flagship, the giant battleship Yamato. At over 70,000 tons, she was the most powerful battleship ever built, her guns so massive that a single broadside could shatter any ship afloat. Yamamoto had chosen to sail with the main body, far to the rear of the carrier force. He wanted to be in position to deliver the coup de grace once the Americans had been drawn into battle. His confidence was unshakable. He believed his plan left no room for failure. At the same time, other Japanese forces were moving into place. To the north, toward the bleak waters of the Aleutian Islands, a diversionary fleet steamed forward. Their orders were to strike at Dutch Harbor and to land troops on Attu and Kiska. It was a ploy designed to distract the Americans, to force them to scatter their carriers between the northern and central Pacific. To the south and west, invasion forces with transports, troops, and equipment churned toward Midway itself. From every direction, Japanese power converged on a single point in the ocean, unaware that their grand scheme was already compromised. For in Pearl Harbor, American codebreakers had revealed the truth. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team had unmasked Yamamoto's plan, decrypted his signals, and warned Admiral Chester Nimitz of the danger. Thanks to their work, Nimitz knew not only the place but the timing of the Japanese strike. Armed with this precious knowledge, he prepared his own trap. The United States did not possess the numbers, the experience, or the firepower of the Japanese Navy. What it did possess was resilience, determination, and the advantage of foresight. Nimitz knew he could not hope to match Yamamoto ship for ship. Instead, he would concentrate what strength he had into a single strike force. At its heart were three carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the battered Yorktown. Against 4 Japanese carriers, it was a narrow margin, but it would have to be enough. The Yorktown was the most improbable of the trio. Only weeks before, she had been mauled at the Battle of the Coral Sea, struck by bombs, left smoking and scarred. Dockyard workers in Pearl Harbor shook their heads when they first surveyed the damage. 3 months of repairs, they estimated, would be needed before she could return to sea. Admiral Nimitz gave them 3 days. The order seemed impossible, yet the men labored without rest, welding, hammering, patching holes with steel plates, rerouting fuel lines, restoring engines. Day and night the shipyard roared, sparks flying in showers as crews worked in shifts. Sailors and civilians alike knew the urgency. If the Yorktown could not sail, the battle might be lost before it even began. Miraculously, in 72 hours, she was ready. Her scars were not healed, her hull not fully restored, but she was seaworthy and she could fight. When she left Pearl Harbor, she carried not only her own crew but hundreds of repairmen still aboard, tools in hand, ready to keep her alive in the coming struggle. The Enterprise and Hornet, by contrast, were newer and unscathed, their decks polished, their air groups sharp. Together, the 3 carriers formed the core of Task Force 16 and Task Force 17 under Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Fletcher. They were supported by cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, smaller vessels that would provide screens against attack, though all knew that in this new age of carrier warfare, the battle would be decided in the skies. In late May, the American fleet slipped quietly out of Pearl Harbor, vanishing into the Pacific. Their departure was secret, their destination known only to a few. To the sailors who stood on deck, watching the green shores of Oahu fade into the horizon, there was a feeling of gravity, of something immense approaching. Many were young, barely out of high school, some with only weeks of training. They smoked cigarettes nervously, played cards in mess halls, or sat silently in their bunks, writing letters they knew might be their last. The officers briefed them carefully, but sparingly. The less they knew, the less they might reveal if captured. All that mattered was this: they were sailing to meet the Japanese, and the fate of the Pacific rested on what would happen next. As the days stretched on, the fleets drew nearer. Across thousands of miles of water, neither side yet saw the other, though both were aware of what lay ahead. For the Japanese, the sense of inevitability was strong. Their carriers had triumphed everywhere they had gone. Their pilots were veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and countless other battles. Their formations were drilled to perfection, their doctrine honed by years of practice. On their decks, the Zero fighters sat gleaming in the sun, the Val dive bombers and Kate torpedo bombers lined up in neat rows. The men who flew them believed themselves invincible, and with reason. Until now, they had never known defeat. For the Americans, the feeling was different. They were underdogs, outnumbered, still scarred by Pearl Harbor, still grieving lost comrades in the Philippines, in Singapore, in Java. But they also carried with them a sense of resolve. The blow at Pearl Harbor had united the United States, had turned shock into determination. Every man aboard those ships knew what had been done to their country 6 months earlier. They knew that this battle was not just about Midway, not just about a tiny atoll of sand. It was about revenge, about proving that America would not break, about beginning the long road back across the Pacific. Night after night, the carriers steamed silently, their decks darkened, their lights dimmed. Pilots trained in the hours of dusk, practicing takeoffs and landings, while sailors checked ammunition, tested guns, and listened to the steady heartbeat of the engines deep below. Chaplains held quiet services. Men bowed their heads, prayers whispered in the gloom. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese were coming. The knowledge was unspoken, but it weighed heavily on every mind. On Midway itself, the garrison waited. Marines dug foxholes into the sandy soil. Anti-aircraft crews polished and checked their guns, aligning them toward the sky. Aircraft were dispersed across the island, hidden as best they could among scrub and camouflage nets. Pilots sat on the edge of their bunks, staring at the sky, wondering if this would be their last morning. The atoll was small, exposed and vulnerable, but the men who stood upon it knew they were at the very center of the war. By June 2nd, the fleets were in position. The Japanese approached from the northwest, their carriers ready to launch the first strike on Midway. Yamamoto's great battleships steamed far behind, eager for the moment when they would deliver the finishing blow. The Aleutian diversion was already underway, with planes bombing Dutch harbor. Yet the Americans had not taken the bait. Nimitz had seen through the ploy, holding his forces steady. His carriers lay hidden to the northeast of Midway, waiting for the moment to pounce. The ocean was vast, but in its trying emptiness. Two great predators were closing on each other, unseen, unheard, yet certain of contact. The Americans held their breath, knowing that the advantage of surprise was theirs. The Japanese moved with confidence, unaware that their secrets had already been revealed, their trap already compromised. The fleets had assembled. The stage was set. In only days, perhaps only hours, the battle would begin. The fate of nations, the future of the Pacific, the course of the entire war, would be decided not by armies on land, not by battleships firing their great guns, but by young men in fragile aircraft climbing into the sky above a tiny atoll in the middle of the sea. And as the waves rolled on and the winds carried the fleets ever closer, history waited. The atoll called Midway had always been a lonely place. Two small islands of coral and sand, resting at the far edge of the Hawaiian chain, battered by waves, swept by winds, and often overlooked in the vast expanse of the Pacific. Before the war, few beyond naval officers, a handful of aviators, or the Pan-American clippers that used the lagoon for refueling, had reason to think about it. But in the spring of 1942, this remote place became the center of the world. Its name was whispered in Tokyo, in Washington, in Pearl Harbor, and on the rolling decks of carriers at sea. Midway was no longer a forgotten outpost. It was the prize that both sides believed could tilt the balance of the war. By the last days of May, the garrison of Midway had swelled with reinforcements. Marines, sailors, and airmen crowded the small islands, stringing barbed wire across the beaches, digging trenches in the sand, stacking sandbags around gun positions. Heavy guns were rolled into place, their barrels pointing seaward, though all knew that the real danger would come from the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries were mounted wherever there was space, manned by crews who practiced again and again, aiming at nothing but the open sky, waiting for the day when Japanese planes would come shrieking out of the Sunday. The men worked under the harsh sun by day, their uniforms soaked with sweat, and under dim lamps at night, hammering, digging, hauling. They built revetments for aircraft, carved runways from the coral, and dug command posts into the ground. The airstrips stretched out across sand and eastern islands, narrow ribbons of pale coral where bombers and fighters could thunder into the air. Around them, men camouflaged the aircraft as best they could, painting nets with greens and browns, dragging branches to cover wings, scattering debris to break up their outlines. They knew it would not fool the sharp eyes of Japanese pilots forever, but perhaps it would delay discovery for precious minutes. Aircraft of every kind crowded the runways. Old Marine F-2 Buffaloes, stubby little fighters that had already been outclassed in combat, were polished, fueled, and armed. Beside them sat a few newer F-4F Wildcats, sturdier machines with heavier guns, but still slower than the feared Japanese Zero. The Marine pilots who strapped themselves into these planes knew the odds were against them. They had read the reports from Wake, from the Philippines, from the Coral Sea. They knew how easily the Zero outclimbed and outturned them, how quickly American squadrons had been cut down. Still, they prepared, checking their ammunition, rehearsing takeoffs, memorizing formations. They told themselves that surprise, courage, and sheer determination might make up for the shortcomings of their machines. Larger aircraft were lined up in clusters. B-17, flying fortresses of the Army Air Forces, sat with their great wings spread wide, engines rumbling as mechanics worked on them. Their crews, who had trained to bomb German cities from high altitude, now prepared for a very different mission: to search the Pacific and strike at Japanese ships. Their officers briefed them that they would fly long hours over empty ocean, watching the horizon for the faintest smudge of smoke, the tiniest dark speck on the waves. If they found the enemy, they would attack from high above, dropping their bombs into the clustered decks of carriers and cruisers. Few of the men were confident in the accuracy of such attacks, but it was the role they had been given. In one corner of the field, 6 brand-new TBF Avengers sat gleaming. They had arrived only days before, rushed from factories on the mainland, so new that their paint seemed barely dry. Their crews had almost no combat experience, their manuals still fresh, their machines barely tested. Yet they represented the future of American torpedo aviation, heavy, powerful, equipped with a turret, and able to carry their torpedoes inside a bomb bay. The men who would fly them knew they were untested, but they were proud to have them. Soon they would be thrown into battle, their baptism of fire coming sooner than anyone imagined. And all around the island, hidden in the coves and anchored in the lagoon, PBY Catalinas rested on their hulls. These flying boats were not glamorous, they were slow, ungainly, and vulnerable, but they were eyes in the sky, capable of searching immense distances, of finding what no one else could see. Their crews were hardened by long hours, flying at low altitude, with nothing but ocean below, their ears filled with the steady drone of engines. It would be these Catalinas, more than any other aircraft, that might find the Japanese first, giving warning of what was coming. Every day, men at Midway drilled. They practiced scrambling their fighters into the air at the sound of the alarm. They rehearsed loading bombs and torpedoes onto planes, refueling under pressure, clearing the runways of debris. The Marines on the ground tested their rifles, manned their machine guns, adjusted their helmets. The anti-aircraft gunners rehearsed the dance of loading shells, aiming, firing, reloading. Everyone knew the attack was coming. The only questions were when, and from which direction. On May 30th, as the sun set over the lagoon, the atmosphere on Midway was heavy with expectation. The sky turned red, then purple, and darkness fell over the island. Searchlights probed the sky. The men slept fitfully in their bunks, their rifles leaning against the walls, their boots at the ready. Some wrote letters home, uncertain if they would ever be mailed. Others sat quietly, smoking, staring at the horizon. There was a sense that time itself had slowed, that every minute carried the weight of history. Thousands of miles away, on the rolling decks of Japanese carriers, men performed their own rituals. Pilots inspected their Zeros, ran hands along the fuselage, checked their machine guns. Mechanics fueled planes, strapped bombs beneath wings, tightened bolts, and checked fuel lines. Commanders briefed their men with maps unrolled on tables, showing Midway at the center, the plan drawn in neat lines of ink. Nagumo's carriers moved closer each day, their wakes trailing long white scars across the Pacific. To the men aboard them, Midway seemed already within their grasp. But on Midway itself, the defenders were not frightened into despair. They were resolved. They knew they might die, but they also knew that they stood on the front line of America's defense. The words of Admiral Nimitz had reached them, telling them that they were crucial, that the fate of the Pacific depended on their courage. They took strength from that. They dug deeper, worked longer, prepared harder. By June 2nd, the first contacts were made. Out over the ocean, a Catalina spotted the silhouettes of Japanese transports. The radio crackled with the news. Enemy ships approaching. The men on Midway stiffened. The long wait was ending. The Japanese were near. The following day, tension rose higher still. Scouts returned with more sightings. Reports confirmed that this was no small force, it was the heart of the Japanese Navy. The Marines cleaned their disconcertable reveling rifles again, even if they had done it only hours before. The pilots strapped into their aircraft, their engines roaring as they taxied down the runways for test flights. The men of the island braced themselves, waiting for the hammer to fall. On the evening of June 3rd, as darkness fell, the sky was alive with sound. Catalinas took off into the night, their crews scanning the ocean below, eyes straining in the dim light. Somewhere out there was the enemy, moving ever closer. Searchlights swept the lagoon, guns pointed skyward, ready for the first wave. The men of Midway went to sleep, knowing that the next dawn might bring fire and death. The island itself seemed to hold its breath. The surf rolled gently onto the sand. The albatross wheeled overhead, their cries carried on the wind. Beneath the waves, coral glowed in the moonlight, untouched by the storm about to descend. It was a moment of deceptive calm, the stillness before the storm, when everything is poised to change, when the world itself feels as though it is waiting. And in that silence, the defenders of Midway prepared. They whispered to each other in the darkness, promising to stand firm. They tightened the straps of their helmets, checked the bolts on their rifles, and looked once more at the runways stretching out into the night. They knew the enemy was coming. They knew the morning would bring battle. When the sun rose, it would no longer be an ordinary day on a remote atoll. It would be the beginning of one of the greatest battles the world had ever seen. And for the men who waited there, Midway was no longer just a name on a map. It was destiny. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. The dawn of June 3rd, 1942, brought with it a pale light over the Pacific. The horizon glowed faintly pink, and the waves reflected the colors of the sky. Midway lay quiet in the early morning, the air heavy with anticipation. The men stationed on the atoll stirred awake, many of them already half-dressed, boots laced, rifles nearby. Few had slept deeply. The day they had prepared for was finally here. Out in the vast emptiness of the sea, Catalina flying boats droned through the sky. Their broad wings carried them mile after mile, engines rumbling steadily as crews scanned the horizon. Each man aboard understood the importance of his mission. These were the eyes of the American defense, tasked with locating the advancing Japanese fleet before it arrived at striking distance. The crews leaned against their windows, binoculars pressed tightly to their faces, scanning for the faintest glimmer of metal, the thin line of smoke, the impossible-to-miss silhouette of warships cutting through the sea. At 9 in the morning, Ensign Jack Reed, flying his PBY Catalina, caught sight of something that made his heart jolt. Two dark specks on the horizon. At first they seemed like shadows on the water, distant shapes that could have been tricks of the light. But as the Catalina drew closer, the forms grew larger and sharper. They were ships, no doubt about it, steaming in formation. He grabbed the radio, his voice steady but carrying the edge of excitement. The transmission went out. 2 enemy cargo vessels sighted. The report reached Midway quickly. It was the first solid confirmation that the Japanese fleet was closing in. Commanders on the atoll gathered around the radios, listening as every word came through in bursts of static. The tension in the command posts deepened. The Japanese were indeed coming, and they were close enough to be found. Minutes later, another Catalina returned with a far more chilling report. A large formation of ships had been spotted: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers. This was no small raiding party. It was the main body of Yamamoto's fleet. The words came in sharp and unmistakable: sighted main body. Back on Midway, the garrison braced. Air crews rushed to their stations. Pilots strapped themselves into their cockpits. Mechanics wheeled bombs onto runways. Ground crews fueled aircraft as fast as their hands could move. Marines manned their anti-aircraft guns, helmets strapped, eyes skyward, waiting for the attack that seemed inevitable. By noon, the first American response was launched. From the airstrips on Midway, 9 B-17 flying fortresses lumbered into the sky, their engines roaring, wings heavy with bombs. They climbed slowly, circling over the atoll before turning northwest toward the coordinates reported by the Catalinas. Inside their cockpits, crews sat tense and silent, adjusting their controls, watching the horizon. Hours passed as they droned over the ocean, nothing but blue, stretching endlessly beneath them. Finally, just before 3 o'clock, they spotted dark lines on the horizon. Ships, dozens of them. The Japanese invasion force. The bombers tightened their formation. At 20,000 feet, they began their runs, bomb bay doors opening with a metallic clatter. The bombs tumbled downward, tiny black specks against the immensity of the ocean. The crews held their breath, watching for explosions. A splash, a plume of water, and another, but no hits. The Japanese ships weaved and turned sharply, their captains maneuvering with skill honed through years of training. Not a single ship was struck. Still, the sight of the great enemy fleet rolling through the Pacific had left an impression. The Americans had drawn blood with their determination, even if no damage had been done. Reports flowed back to Midway. The Japanese were vast in number. They were closing fast. The defenders understood now that the battle would not be days away. It would be tomorrow. As night fell, tension thickened like a storm cloud. On Midway, searchlights swept the skies, probing the darkness for aircraft that might come. Anti-aircraft gunners stood ready, their hands on triggers, scanning the heavens. The soldiers, sailors, and marines of the atoll moved quietly in the shadows, conserving their energy, waiting for what dawn would bring. Some wrote hurried letters by lamplight, scribbling words of love and hope, unsure if their families would ever see them. Others lay in their bunks, staring at the ceiling, hearing the low rumble of the surf and the distant drone of aircraft engines. In the darkness over the ocean, Catalinas continued their vigil. At 2 in the morning, one Catalina crew spotted the silhouettes of Japanese transports. They banked low, lined up for an attack, and dropped torpedoes. One struck home, slamming into an oiler. Flames licked the water, smoke rose into the night sky. It was a small victory, almost insignificant in the grand scale, but it was enough to lift the spirits of the men on Midway when the report came through. The defenders cheered quietly, comforted by the knowledge that they had at least drawn first blood. Meanwhile, on the Japanese carriers, final preparations for battle were underway. Pilots checked their planes. Crews armed bombs and torpedoes. Mechanics worked in silence beneath dim lanterns. On each deck, Shinto shrines were honored, rituals carried out with solemnity. The men bowed their heads, whispered their prayers, and made peace with the possibility that they would not see another sunrise. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the carrier strike force, paced his flag bridge aboard Akagi. Reports from his scouts had not yet revealed any sign of American carriers. His confidence was steady. The plan was unfolding as Yamamoto had intended. Midway would be struck at dawn, its defenses shattered, its air power destroyed, its runways cratered. Afterward, his ships would land troops, and the atoll would fall into Japanese hands. And so, the night deepened. Across thousands of miles, the two great forces closed the distance, like predators circling one another in the dark. Neither side could see the other clearly, yet both understood the stakes. For Japan, Midway meant security, dominance, and the fulfillment of Yamamoto's plan. For America, Midway meant survival, the thin line holding back the tide. When the first light of June 4th crept over the Pacific, the calm of the ocean belied the violence about to erupt. The surface of the waters shimmered, the sky blushed with color, and seabirds wheeled lazily above the waves. On Midway, the island stirred awake once more, but there was no normality now. Every man knew that this sunrise would be unlike any other. It would bring with it the roar of engines, the scream of bombs, and the fire of war. The defenders of Midway stood ready. The Catalinas had done their work. The scouts had sighted the enemy. The B-17 seconds had flown their first mission, and now, in the stillness of dawn, both sides braced themselves. The waiting was over. The first blows were about to fall. The Battle of Midway had begun. The night was slipping away. The clock struck 4:30 in the morning on June 4, 1942. The Pacific was quiet, the waves moving softly beneath the faint glow of dawn. A calm so fragile it felt like a thin sheet of glass stretched across the ocean. On four great carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the stillness was broken by the steady thunder of engines warming on flight decks. The time for waiting was over. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship Akagi. His face was stern, his eyes set on the horizon, but inside his mind the calculations never ceased. Reports had confirmed the position of Midway, and though no American fleet had yet been detected, he could not afford hesitation. His orders were clear: launch the first wave and neutralize the island's air defenses. Then, only then, could the invasion force move in. Below him, the decks trembled with life. Crews moved in swift rhythm, men guiding aircraft into position. Mechanics checked engines, their hands slick with oil and sweat despite the cool dawn air. Armorers strapped bombs beneath. Fuselages, heavy cylinders of steel filled with explosive promise. Pilots adjusted goggles and tightened straps, their faces unreadable in the half-light. The ritual before battle was familiar to them. For months, they had flown sorties across Asia and the Pacific. Some had been at Pearl Harbor, others in the skies over the Coral Sea. They were veterans now, hardened by experience, shaped by victory. Yet on this morning, even for them, there was something different in the air. This was not a raid on a far-off port. This was an operation that might decide the fate of the empire. Each man felt it, though few spoke the thought aloud. At precisely 0430 hours, the order was given. Aircraft engines roared, their pitch rising as propellers spun into blurs. The first planes crept forward, wheels rattling over wooden planks, wings trembling with the rush of wind. One after another, fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes raced down the decks and leapt into the air, climbing against the soft hues of dawn. The carrier's decks grew lighter with every departure, each plane shrinking into specks on the horizon until the sky itself seemed filled with them. 108 aircraft in all had lifted into the morning, bound for Midway. Fighters to sweep the skies clear of opposition. Dive bombers armed with heavy payloads to strike at airstrips and hangars. Torpedo bombers to finish what others left standing. A symphony of destruction, orchestrated with meticulous care. On Midway Atoll, the silence of dawn was broken not by bird song but by the hum of radar. The operators leaned close over their screens, the green glow illuminating their tired faces. At 0530, the blips appeared, small at first, then growing in number, until the truth was undeniable. A wave of enemy aircraft, heading straight for them. The alarm was raised. Bells rang out across the island. Loudspeakers blared orders. Men scrambled from their bunks, boots thudding on wooden floors, helmets strapped as they ran. Pilots rushed for their planes, the old but reliable Wildcats and Buffaloes of the Marine Corps fighter squadrons. Mechanics worked furiously, pulling away wheel chocks, waving signals. Marines manned their anti-aircraft guns, their hands steady on triggers, eyes narrowed against the sky. The island's defenses, battered but determined, readied themselves for the storm. The first Japanese planes appeared as specks on the horizon, dark against the growing light of dawn. The sound came next, a low hum that grew steadily louder until it was a buzzing roar. The sky filled with shapes, their formation tight, their wings glinting in the sunlight. The defenders felt their stomachs tighten. The attack was here. The Marine fighters took off in desperate haste. Their engines strained as they clawed into the sky, climbing to meet the enemy. They were outnumbered, their aircraft outclassed, yet not one hesitated. The Wildcats and Buffaloes rose into the path of the Japanese, pilots gripping controls with white-knuckled determination. When the two forces met, the sky exploded into chaos. Zeros of the Imperial Navy swooped in with grace and deadly precision, their guns chattering. American fighters twisted and turned, diving, climbing, rolling, trying to match their enemies' maneuvers. Bullets traced invisible lines across the sky. Shells burst, planes caught fire, and spiraled downward, trailing smoke. Men fought not with tactics alone but with raw instinct, adrenaline guiding their every move. Below, the bombers pressed on. They dove toward Midway's runways, bombs tumbling downward, shrieking as they fell. Explosions tore into the earth, craters blooming across the airstrips. Fuel tanks erupted in fireballs, thick black smoke coiling skyward. Hangars collapsed in showers of sparks and twisted steel. The ground shook with the force of it, men thrown from their feet as the island seemed to groan under the assault. Anti-aircraft guns barked in reply. From sandbagged emplacements and concrete bunkers, Marines fired relentlessly, their guns pounding skyward, filling the air with bursts of shrapnel. Black puffs of smoke dotted the sky, planes shuddered as they flew through the barrages. Some caught fire, spiraling down into the ocean with a hiss of steam or crashing in flames across the island's surface. The gunners cheered briefly for each kill, then turned their sights once more to the swarm above them. On the ground, chaos reigned. Men ran through smoke and fire, pulling wounded comrades to safety. Medics shouted orders, dragging stretchers, bandaging wounds with hands trembling from exhaustion and fear. The acrid smell of burning fuel filled the air, mixing with the salty tang of the sea. The heat of flames seared the skin, sweat running down faces streaked with soot. Through it all, Midway held. Though buildings burned and planes were destroyed on the ground, though the island shook under the pounding, the runways themselves were not destroyed. The Japanese strike had left behind devastation, but not ruin. The Americans still had teeth, and the defenders knew it. At 0643 hours, the Japanese strike leader radioed his report. The island had been heavily damaged, but not silenced. Most of Midway's aircraft had escaped destruction. The runways were still usable. More would be needed to finish the job. The message reached Nagumo aboard Akagi, and with it came the first difficult decision of the day. Nagumo weighed the facts carefully. His first strike had not achieved its goal. Midway still posed a threat. Another attack would be needed to suppress its defenses. But even as he considered this, reports began to filter in enemy planes were approaching his fleet. Not many, perhaps, but enough to force caution. He hesitated. Should he launch his reserve planes for a second strike on Midway, or hold them ready in case American carriers were nearby? For a few moments, he chose the first course. Preparations began to rearm the waiting aircraft. Bombs were hauled out, Torpedoes moved, fuel lines snaked across decks. The crews worked feverishly, every man aware of the urgency. Yet the decks grew dangerously cluttered, safety procedures abandoned in the rush. Explosives and fuel sat exposed, a risk waiting to ignite. And then, just as the work was underway, another message arrived. A scout plane had spotted an American carrier. The very threat Nagumo had dismissed as unlikely was suddenly real. At once, his plans teetered. Should he press on with his second strike on Midway or swing his full force against the American fleet? The minutes ticked by, each one carrying the weight of history. The decks of the carriers buzzed with activity, bombs half-loaded, fuel lines dripping. Pilots sat in cockpits waiting for orders, sweat beading on their foreheads. Nagumo hesitated, his choice unfinished, the moment stretching unbearably long. Meanwhile, above Midway, the sky still shook with combat. American bombers roared off the runways to strike back at the Japanese fleet. Torpedo planes lumbered into the air, their crews knowing full well the odds they faced. Dive bombers climbed into the sun, their wings glinting. They flew not for survival but for duty, for the island burning behind them, for the ships waiting out at sea. The Japanese strike had come and gone, leaving fire and smoke in its wake. Yet Midway still stood, battered but alive. The defenders had not broken, and as the Japanese turned their gaze toward the sea, they would soon discover that the true test of the day had only just begun. The sky above the Pacific was a restless canvas of smoke, clouds, and sunlight. The first Japanese strike had left Midway scarred but still breathing, its runways blackened, its buildings torn apart, yet its defenders unbroken. The air was heavy with the smell of burnt fuel, the earth still shuddering from the bombardments, but from that chaos rose the sound of engines once more. The Americans were not done. They would not allow the island to be silenced. On Midway, pilots who had watched their comrades fall from the sky now climbed into cockpits streaked with soot and grime. Mechanics worked furiously, patching bullet holes with whatever they could, checking fuel lines that dripped like veins torn open. Marine aviators, Army pilots, Navy flyers all shared one thought. They had to find the Japanese carriers. They had to strike back, even if it meant certain death. The command came swiftly. Squadrons lifted into the sky, their wheels leaving the ground amid smoke still curling from the craters. Torpedo planes lumbered forward, heavy with their deadly cargo, while dive bombers, lighter and faster, circled and climbed toward the Sunday. Their formations were ragged, their radios unreliable, but their hearts beat steady with a single resolve: to reach the enemy fleet, to do whatever damage they could before the inevitable wall of fire swallowed them. The first of these attacks came from Midway's own airfield. 6 stubby torpedo bombers, the brand-new TBF Avengers, flying their first combat mission, launched into the dawn. Behind them followed 4 B-26 Marauders, bristling with weapons, their bellies armed with torpedoes as well. 10 aircraft in all, straining against the odds, heading toward a fleet guarded by dozens of Zeros and curtains of anti-aircraft fire. The ocean beneath them stretched wide and endless. The morning sun glared in their eyes, and the men gripped their controls tighter as the minutes dragged on. Then, at last, the horizon shifted. Ships appeared, dark, angular forms cutting through the waves, wakes trailing behind like scars. The Japanese carriers were in sight. The Avengers went first. Their pilots pushed their throttles forward, diving low over the waves, the spray almost touching their wings. The Zeros were upon them in an instant, dropping from the sky with the speed and grace of hawks. Machine guns rattled, tracers streaked, and the Avengers were torn apart one by one. Planes burst into flames, plunging into the sea, explosions sending waterspouts high into the air. Yet the survivors pressed on. They lined up for their torpedo runs, aiming at the looming hulls of Akagi and Kaga, trying to steady their trembling aircraft against the storm of bullets. Not one torpedo found its mark. Only a single Avenger, riddled with holes and its crew half dead, limped back toward Midway. The B-26 Marauders followed, their engines roaring defiantly. They swooped low, their torpedoes slung beneath them, but the Zeros cut into them savagely. One was shot down almost immediately, plunging into the sea in flames. Another, mortally wounded, turned itself into a missile and dove straight at Akagi's flight deck, narrowly missing and smashing into the water with such force that Japanese sailors swore it had struck the ship. Two more launched their torpedoes, but again none hit. Only two marauders, scarred and barely airworthy, managed to break away and stagger back toward the atoll. The attack had achieved nothing on paper. No Japanese carrier had been struck, no warship even scratched. But in that violent half-hour, something else had been set in motion. The Japanese decks were thrown into disorder. Pilots looked skyward with unease. Crews raced to man guns, to put out fires, to prepare for more. The Americans had shown they would not sit idly by. They would come, again and again, until either they were annihilated or the enemy was broken. At Midway itself, more squadrons prepared for the next sortie. B-17 flying fortresses, those massive four-engined bombers, roared into the sky. They climbed high, engines droning, their bomb bays loaded with heavy ordnance. From their altitude, they could see far across the ocean, the sunlight glinting off waves that seemed to roll forever. Their mission was to bomb the Japanese fleet from on high, to disrupt, confuse, and, if fate allowed, to destroy. Hours passed, as they closed the indelible distance. Then the great shadows of the enemy fleet appeared below them, tiny from their height, yet bristling with menace. The bomb bay doors yawned open, and bombs tumbled free, falling for long seconds through the air. The crews peered downward, eyes straining, hearts pounding. Explosions erupted far below, geysers of water rising near the ships, but none struck home. The Japanese vessels, nimble and disciplined, twisted and turned to evade. Not one suffered a direct hit. Still, the rain of bombs unsettled the sailors on deck. They knew the Americans were out there, searching for them, harrying them. Each attack, no matter how fruitless, kept them on edge. And as more reports trickled in of enemy squadrons approaching, Admiral Nagumo's mind became a storm of doubt. Should he press his second strike on Midway, or hold his planes for the American carriers that surely must be somewhere nearby? It was a question he could not easily answer. His first strike had failed to silence Midway. The runways still functioned, the defenses still stood, but every moment he delayed risked disaster. The Americans, it seemed, were everywhere at once. As Nagumo wrestled with his choices, more American squadrons arrived. This time they came from the carriers Hornet and Enterprise, Task Force 16 under Admiral Spruance. Their torpedo squadrons launched first. They were slow, outdated planes, Douglas TBD Devastators with brave men at the controls. The crews of Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet knew what they faced. They had trained, drilled, and flown countless hours together. They also knew their aircraft were obsolete, their speed no match for the Zeros, their armor thin, their guns too few. Yet they launched anyway, flying low and steady over the waves, their torpedoes heavy beneath them. As they approached the Japanese fleet, the sky erupted with fire. Zeros dived upon them from every angle, machine guns blazing. Planes burst apart in midair, others trailed smoke and plunged into the sea. One after another, devastators fell, until the squadron was reduced to wreckage on the ocean. Not one torpedo struck its target. Out of 15 planes, only one pilot survived, Ensign George Gay. He floated in the sea, clinging to life, forced to watch the battle unfold before him, the only witness of his squadron's sacrifice. From Enterprise came Torpedo Squadron 6, and from Yorktown, Torpedo Squadron 3. Their fate was little different. They pressed forward bravely, flying into the jaws of death, their planes riddled by gunfire, their crews dying at their posts. Again, no torpedo found its mark. Again, nearly all were lost. It seemed a tragedy beyond measure. Wave after wave of American planes dashed themselves against the Japanese defenses, only to be slaughtered. Pilots who had trained for years, who had written final letters to their families, gave their lives in attacks that achieved nothing tangible. By the end of the morning, dozens of aircraft lay at the bottom of the sea, their crews gone, their torpedoes wasted, and yet there was something unseen in their sacrifice. In their desperate charges, in their willingness to face certain destruction, they achieved what no calculation could predict. The Japanese combat air patrol had been dragged low, forced to chase and cut down the torpedo bombers that came skimming over the waves. The Zeros, once circling high above to guard the carriers, were now down near the water, chasing shadows and finishing kills. The skies above the fleet, for a brief moment, stood open. It was in that moment that fate began to shift. The dive bombers of Enterprise and Yorktown, who had struggled to find the Japanese fleet, finally approached from the north and east. They had climbed high, waiting, circling, searching. Now, guided by instinct and fragments of reports, they descended upon the enemy. They came unopposed, the Zeros distracted, the decks below cluttered with bombs and fuel from Nagumo's. Indecision. But that was the moment to come. For now, the first counterattacks had been written in blood. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8, Torpedo Squadron 6, and Torpedo Squadron 3 had not struck a single ship, yet they had changed everything. Their courage, their sacrifice, their determination to fly straight into the teeth of death had tilted the balance. They had left the skies clear for what was about to follow. The cost had been almost unbearable. The sea was littered with wreckage, the sky with smoke trails, the hearts of survivors heavy with grief. Yet in that sacrifice lay the opening America needed. The carriers still sailed, the battle still raged, and the tide had not yet turned. The first American counterattacks had failed in their purpose, but they had succeeded in something deeper. They had kept the Japanese off balance. They had sown fear, uncertainty, and delay, and they had paved the way for the strike that would decide the fate of Midway and perhaps the entire Pacific War. The morning was only half over. The greatest blows were still to fall. The morning of June 4th rolled steadily onward, the sun climbing higher into the sky, casting its relentless light across the wide Pacific. The air shimmered with heat. The ocean stretched endlessly, blue and merciless. All around Midway, the battle had already grown bloody and desperate. From the early attacks by Midway's defenders, to the slaughter of the torpedo squadrons, to the constant haunting sound of aircraft engines, the hours since dawn had been filled with chaos. On the Japanese carriers, smoke still drifted across the decks. Men hurried to and fro with bombs and torpedoes in their arms, sweating beneath the sunday. Fuel hoses trailed across the planks like coiled snakes, dripping fumes into the air. Planes had landed and been hauled below, where mechanics rearmed them. Confused orders, sending crews scrambling to swap weapons again and again. Admiral Nagumo's hesitation, his fateful choice to hold back, then to change, then to hold again, had left his decks dangerously cluttered. Bombs lay stacked beside aircraft, torpedoes slung in rows, drums of fuel standing uncapped. It was as if the carriers had been transformed into floating powder kegs, waiting only for a spark. And that spark was about to come. Far above, unseen against the glare of the sun, American dive bombers searched the sky. They had been circling, fanning out, desperately trying to locate the Japanese fleet. Time was running short. Many planes were low on fuel, some already near the point of turning back, but fortune or fate intervened. From Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey led a group of dauntless dive bombers. He had been searching for hours, eyes strained against the horizon, maps folded and unfolded, his pilots growing tense with each passing minute. The fleet was nowhere to be seen. But then, far below, he spotted something unusual. The thin wake of a lone destroyer, cutting a white line across the ocean. The ship, Arashi, had been left behind, straggling back to rejoin the carriers after chasing away a submarine. McCluskey saw the trail and followed it, gambling everything on the hunch that the destroyer was racing back to its fleet. His decision proved fateful. Minutes later, as the bombers banked and turned, the dark shapes of the Japanese carriers spread across the water. 4 of them, mighty and imposing, with escorts bristling around them. McCluskey's heart pounded. At last, they had found their prey. And at that very moment, by chance and by fortune, Yorktown's dive bombers under Max Leslie also appeared from another direction. Two groups, arriving simultaneously, converged upon the same target. Down below, on the decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, crews labored frantically, unaware of the silent eyes peering at them from above the clouds. They were preparing their aircraft for the second strike on Midway. Weapons scattered. Across the decks, men bent over engines, pilots strapping into cockpits. Few looked upward. The Zeros that might have stopped the attack were far below, chasing torpedo planes that had already been slaughtered. The sky above the carriers was clear, open, and undefended. And then the Dauntlesses tipped their noses downward. From high above the clouds, the dive bombers began their descent. The shriek of air tore past the canopies as they plunged, one after another, toward the enemy fleet. Bomb bay doors opened wide. The men inside braced themselves against the crushing pull of gravity, hands gripping their controls, eyes fixed on the silhouettes of ships growing larger by the second. The first target was Kaga. Dozens of Dauntlesses screamed down upon her, the wind howling, bullets spraying from defensive gunners as Japanese crews scrambled below. A single bomb hit near her forward elevator, tearing through the deck and exploding with ferocious force. The blast ripped apart parked planes, fuel tanks ruptured, and fire surged upward in a geyser of flame. Seconds later, another bomb struck amidships, igniting rows of armed aircraft. Explosions chained one after another, fireballs ripping through the hangars. Then a third bomb crashed down, detonating deep within her hull. Kaga shuddered from bow to stern, flames bursting skyward, her decks a cauldron of destruction. Akagi was next. 3 bombers peeled off toward her, angling steeply down. One bomb missed, splashing into the sea. But another found its mark, slamming directly into the rear of the flight deck, detonating in the hangar where planes sat armed with torpedoes. The explosion was catastrophic. A chain reaction engulfed the ship, her crew powerless to stop the inferno. Akagi, pride of the fleet, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, was mortally wounded by a single decisive strike. On Soryu, chaos unfolded much the same. Dive bombers from Yorktown's squadron came screaming down, their bombs whistling through the air. 3 direct hits smashed into her deck, blowing apart the planes preparing to take off, tearing holes through her structure. Fires erupted, spreading uncontrollably. Her crew fought desperately, but the inferno consumed them. Within minutes, she was burning beyond hope, her decks collapsing under the heat. In the span of just 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's most powerful carriers, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, were transformed into floating infernos. Sailors scrambled across flaming decks, leaping into the sea to escape the heat. Planes that had been meant to destroy Midway now exploded, where they Saturday. The once proud warships, jewels of the Japanese Navy, were crippled beyond repair. On the American side, disbelief mingled with triumph. Pilots pulled up from their dives, looking back at the devastation. Columns of smoke rose skyward, black and thick, visible for miles. The impossible had happened. In minutes, the balance of the Pacific had shifted. But the battle was not over. One Japanese carrier still survived. Hiryu, her decks clear when the attack came, had escaped the initial destruction. Her captain wasted no time. Even as the other ships burned, Hiryu launched her own counterstrike. Squadrons of dive bombers and torpedo planes lifted from her deck, turning their sights on the Americans. Their target was Yorktown. At noon, the Japanese planes found her. They dove through the clouds, bombs whistling downward. Yorktown twisted and turned, her gunners firing furiously. But 2 bombs struck home, shattering her deck, blasting through the funnels, filling her with smoke. She slowed, wounded, but not yet lost. Her crew fought to save her, pumping out water, patching holes, dousing flames. Within an hour, she was steaming again. her flight deck still usable. The damage was bad, but Yorktown had survived. Yet Hiryu was relentless. Another wave was launched, this time torpedo planes, gliding low over the water. Yorktown's fighters met them head-on, shooting many down. But a few slipped through. 2 torpedoes slammed into her side, the blasts throwing men from their feet, rupturing hull plates, flooding compartments. This time, the wounds were mortal. Yorktown listed sharply, smoke pouring from her, her engines failing. Admiral Fletcher gave the order to abandon ship. The proud carrier that had fought at Coral Sea, that had stood as a pillar of the fleet, was dying. Still, Yorktown's sacrifice had bought time. As her crew floated in the sea, pulled aboard destroyers, word came that Enterprise and Hornets bombers had found Hiryu. In the late afternoon, Dauntlesses once again screamed down from the sky. 4 bombs struck true, detonating deep within her decks. Flames erupted, explosions tearing through her hangars. Hiryu, the last of the 4 carriers, was crippled, left burning and broken on the ocean. By sunset, the once mighty Japanese strike force had been destroyed. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay burning, doomed to sink. Hundreds of planes were gone, thousands of sailors and airmen dead. In one single day, Japan's naval supremacy had been shattered. The sea itself bore witness to the devastation. Flames flickered across the water, oil spread in dark sheets, debris floated in the swells. Survivors clung to wreckage, their cries lost to the wind. And above it all, the smoke rose, black pillars marking the graves of ships that had once seemed untouchable. For the Americans, the sight was almost surreal. The losses had been heavy. Yorktown was gone. Dozens of pilots had never returned, but the impossible had been achieved. Against overwhelming odds, they had struck down the core of Japan's carrier fleet. What had begun that morning in doubt and fear ended in triumph so staggering it seemed like destiny itself had intervened. The Battle of Midway had reached its turning point. The tide of war had shifted in a single, breathtaking moment. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons, the skill of the dive bombers, the courage of every man who flew into that firestorm, all had combined to bring about one of the most decisive victories in naval history. Night would fall soon, cloaking the Pacific in darkness once more. Fires still raged, the sea still boiled with wreckage, but the outcome was no longer in question. Midway had been saved. The Japanese advance had been broken, and the balance of power in the Pacific had changed forever. The afternoon of June 4, 1942, had seen the ocean itself turned into a stage of fire and ruin. By that evening, the once mighty carrier fleet of Japan had been struck down. The Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu had been blasted into floating infernos, consumed by fire from the bombs of American dive bombers. And as the sun fell lower, the Hiryu, the last of Japan's strike force, was also fatally wounded, her decks aflame, her planes destroyed. Yet for all of America's triumph, the cost had been heavy. The carrier Yorktown, battered in the Coral Sea only weeks before, had sailed again in defiance of odds. Her hull patched in hurried repairs, her crew proud and determined. She had carried the burden of battle once more at Midway. And though her airmen had fought bravely, though her gunners had held off waves of attackers, Yorktown herself had become the prime target of Japan's fury. When the bombs and torpedoes struck her, the shock of the blows echoed through her steel. Fires raged across her decks, compartments flooded, bulkheads shuddered. Men staggered, choking on smoke, stumbling through corridors lit red by flame. Yet still, the Yorktown would not die easily. Damage control teams, disciplined and tireless, had swarmed across the ship. They pumped water from flooding compartments, smothered flames with hoses and extinguishers, patched holes with whatever they could find. For a time it seemed that Yorktown might endure. She had been struck, she had been scarred, yet her engines still pushed, her rudder still turned. She seemed almost defiant, as though unwilling to let go, unwilling to give up her place in the line. But war at sea was merciless, and the sea itself, patient and unforgiving, waited for its prize. As twilight deepened on June 4th, her crew abandoned her. Admiral Fletcher, his command crippled, had no choice but to transfer authority to Admiral Spruance. Orders were given. Men climbed down ropes and nets, splashed into waiting boats, were hauled onto destroyers that circled protectively nearby. The ship that had carried them through Coral Sea, that had fought beside Enterprise and Hornet at Midway, was left silent, her decks empty, her flag still flying but her corridors quiet. All night she drifted, wounded and alone. The waves lapped against her hull, the fires within her cooling to embers, smoke curling into the night. Around her, destroyers kept watch. Their crews stared across the dark water at the silhouette of their stricken carrier, wondering if she could yet be saved. Some believed she might. The pumps of salvage crews could be brought aboard at dawn. Tugboats might arrive from Pearl Harbor. Perhaps, with luck, Yorktown could be towed back, repaired, reborn once again. The morning of June 5th brought renewed hope. Salvage parties returned to her decks, working cautiously, carefully, in a ship that was eerily quiet after the chaos of battle. They tested the hull, checked compartments, measured her list. The fires were out, but her wounds were deep. Still, she seemed stable enough to attempt rescue. For 2 days, men labored, rigging pumps, sealing breaches, clearing debris. Slowly, incredibly, the Yorktown seemed to right herself. Word spread among the fleet. Perhaps she could be saved. But the ocean, and the enemy, had other plans. Lurking beneath the waves, silent and unseen, was the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe. He had slipped past the American screen in the early hours of June 6th. His periscope scanned the horizon. And there, framed against the light of dawn, was the wounded Yorktown, still afloat, still defiant. Tanabe gave the order. Torpedoes were prepared. The submarine crept closer. At 1:35 inches the afternoon, 4 torpedoes left I-168, streaking silently through the sea. A lookout spotted the trails too late. The torpedoes slammed into the Yorktown and into the destroyer Hamon, which lay alongside her, providing power and pumps for the salvage. The Hamon exploded violently, torn in half, sinking in minutes. Depth charges aboard her went off as she slipped beneath the waves, killing many in the water. Yorktown groaned as the torpedoes struck her. Her list returned, sharper this time, the sea pouring in with renewed force. Pumps failed, salvage crews scattered. The men who had hoped to save her could do no more. The order to abandon ship came once again. For hours, Yorktown clung to life. She refused to sink quickly, as though reluctant to surrender herself to the sea. Her bow rose, then fell. Her list grew steeper, her deck tilting more and more as the horizon shifted around her. Through the afternoon and into the night she drifted, her proud silhouette still visible against the starlit sky. Finally, in the early hours of June 7th, she gave way. The sea claimed her, slowly, almost with ceremony. Her stern rose high, water rushing over her bow, waves pouring through her open decks. Then, with a great shudder, she slipped beneath the surface, her flag still flying, her hull vanishing into the darkness. The ocean closed above her, leaving only an oil slick, scattered wreckage, and the memory of a ship that had fought beyond all measure of endurance. For the men who watched her go, the loss was heartbreaking. Many wept silently as they floated in lifeboats or clung to rails of nearby destroyers. Yorktown had been more than steel and wood. She had been home, a place of duty and brotherhood. She had carried them into battle and back again. And now she was gone, resting on the floor of the Pacific, her name forever bound to the sacrifice of Midway. Yet even in her death, Yorktown had done her duty. She had absorbed the fury of Hiryu's counterstrikes, drawing bombs and torpedoes away from Enterprise and Hornet. She had bought precious time for the other carriers to strike back, to finish Hiryu, to secure victory. In her sacrifice, the balance of the Pacific had shifted. The sailors and airmen of Yorktown lived on to tell her story. They remembered her deck beneath their boots, her engines throbbing through the hull, the roar of aircraft launching into the sky. They remembered her battles, her wounds, and her defiance. And in time, new ships would carry her name, honoring the memory of the carrier that fought at Coral Sea and Midway, and that gave her life so that others might endure. The fate of Yorktown was a reminder that victory never comes without cost. Even as the smoke of burning Japanese carriers rose over the Pacific, even as historians would one day call Midway the turning point of the war, those who had been there knew the price that had been paid. Ships lost, men killed, lives forever changed. For the Americans, the loss of Yorktown was a wound in the midst of triumph. For the Japanese, the destruction of 4 carriers was a wound from which they would never recover. And for the world, Midway became a symbol, a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the strange, cruel balance of war at sea. On the calm waters of the Pacific, as the waves rolled endlessly onward, the wreck of Yorktown settled silently into the deep. Above her, the surface closed, and the ocean resumed its eternal rhythm. The battle was over, but the echoes of Yorktown's struggle and of all who had fought at Midway would linger in memory forever. The Battle of Midway had ended, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. On the surface of the Pacific, smoke still lingered from burning carriers. Oil slicks spread across the Smanti. Water and debris floated in endless patterns. Survivors drifted in rafts or clung to wreckage, their eyes searching the horizon for rescue that, for many, would never come. The ocean was quiet once more, but beneath that calm lay the wrecks of ships that had carried the pride of empires. For Japan, those wrecks meant more than the loss of steel and machinery. They represented something that could never be replaced, the very heart of its naval air arm. The Japanese Navy had entered Midway with confidence, carrying with it the aura of invincibility born from years of victories. Pearl Harbor had been their triumph, a dazzling display of precision and daring. The campaigns that followed, sweeping across the Philippines, seizing Guam, Wake, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, had seemed to confirm their superiority. Their carriers, their pilots, their tactics, all had appeared unstoppable. In June 1942, they believed themselves masters of the Pacific. Yet, in the span of just a few hours, that image shattered. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay at the bottom of the ocean. More than 300 aircraft had been lost, not merely machines, but the finely trained men who flew them. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and deck crews, the lifeblood of the carrier strike force, were gone. These were not raw recruits, not novices. They were veterans, hardened by battles from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, men who had trained for years, who had survived the crucible of early war campaigns. Their experience could not be replicated in a few months or even a few years. Japan's system of pilot training had always been rigorous, almost brutally so. The men selected were screened at a young age, chosen for stamina, skill, and discipline. Only a fraction ever made it through the demanding programs. Those who did emerged as some of the finest naval aviators in the world. But the very strictness of that system became Japan's weakness. It produced excellence, but it produced it in small numbers. By the time war erupted in 1941, Japan's Naval Air Service had only a limited pool of trained pilots. Every battle, every raid, every victory came at a cost. Men lost who could not be quickly replaced. At Midway, the losses cut to the bone. More than 100 of the most skilled aviators of the Kido Butai, the first carrier striking force, were dead or missing. Squadrons that had once flown together with flawless precision were now shattered, their rosters gutted. To the outside world, 4 lost ships seemed the most obvious disaster. To those within the Japanese Navy, It was the men, the irreplaceable pilots and crews, who were the true loss. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the Midway operation, understood this better than most. He knew the United States had immense reserves of industry and manpower. He knew, even as his staff tried to soothe him with words of future plans, that Japan's edge in trained air crews had been broken. The United States could train thousands of new pilots, build new carriers at a pace Japan could never match, and replace lost planes in weeks. For Japan, every pilot gone was a wound that might never heal. The numbers told the story starkly. Between Midway and the earlier Coral Sea engagement, Japan had lost 6 fleet carriers in less than a month of combat. Half of its striking power gone. At Midway alone, more than 3,000 officers and sailors had perished. 4 carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and the best of Japan's aviators were lost. The Americans, in comparison, lost the Yorktown, a destroyer, around 150 aircraft, and just over 300 men. It was not an even trade. It was a devastating imbalance. But beyond numbers, the psychological effect on the Japanese Navy was profound. The aura of invincibility, so carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, was broken. The men who had believed themselves untouchable now faced the reality that they had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and outfought. For the first time, doubt crept into their minds. Doubt about their leadership, doubt about their strategy, doubt about victory itself. In Tokyo, the government moved swiftly to conceal the truth. Official announcements spoke of victories, of American carriers sunk, of Midway's defenses shattered. Newspapers printed glowing reports of Japanese successes. The people were told of glory, not defeat. The 4 carriers, the thousands of men, the loss of elite aviators, all of this was hidden, buried beneath layers of propaganda. Survivors of the battle were isolated, prevented from speaking openly, lest the truth reach the public. Yet within the Navy itself, the truth could not be denied. Senior officers knew the scope of the loss. They knew that the Kido Butai, once the most formidable naval strike force in the world, was gone. They knew that the men lost could never be replaced in time to matter. And as they looked to the future, they understood that from Midway onward, Japan would be fighting not as an aggressor, but as a power increasingly on the defensive. The shift was subtle at first. In the weeks after Midway, Japan still held vast territories. Its armies still occupied China, the Philippines, Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Its fleet still boasted battleships, cruisers, submarines. But the balance of initiative had passed to the Americans. The Japanese would launch no more great offensives like the one at Pearl Harbor or the drive into Southeast Asia. Their moves would become reactive, their resources stretched thinner, their losses harder to replace. And in August, just 2 months after Midway, the Americans struck again, landing Marines on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. It was an operation unthinkable without Midway's victory. With 4 Japanese carriers gone, the United States held the edge long enough to seize the initiative. The campaign that followed was brutal, grinding, costly for both sides. Yet it was a campaign Japan could not afford, and America could. Midway had opened the door, Guadalcanal pushed it wide. Still, the losses at Midway were not merely strategic, they were personal. Each pilot lost was a man with a name, a story, a family. They had been young, many barely in their 20s, their lives cut short in the flames of exploding carriers or the cold embrace of the sea. Survivors spoke later of watching their comrades vanish in fire or sink beneath waves, unable to help, haunted forever by the memory. For those who lived, the battle cast a shadow over all that came after. The veterans of Pearl Harbor, men who had once believed themselves destined for endless triumph, carried with them the scars of Midway. They remembered the chaos of burning decks, the screams of wounded men, the thunder of bombs, the shock of torpedoes, and they remembered the silence afterward, the realization that everything had changed. Historians would later call Midway the turning point of the Pacific War, and indeed it was. But to the men who lived it, the turning point was not simply strategic, it was emotional, psychological, even spiritual. The Japanese Navy lost not only ships and planes, but also its faith in its own invincibility. The Americans, by contrast, gained more than a victory. They gained belief, confidence, momentum. The tide had turned, not just in battle, but in the minds of men. When one looks back at the long war in the Pacific, the vast distances, the countless islands, the endless waves, it is easy to measure events in terms of ships sunk, battles fought, territories gained or lost. But the true heart of Midway lies in the lives that ended there. For Japan, it was the loss of its most experienced pilots, men who had spent years training in the art of carrier warfare, men whose knowledge and skill could not be duplicated quickly enough to matter. For America, it was the loss of Yorktown, a proud carrier that had given everything, and of the 307 men who perished with her. The Pacific would see many more battles, more losses, more sacrifice. Yet Midway remained unique. It was a moment compressed in time, a few hours in which fate shifted from one side to another, reshaping the course of history. The Japanese entered the battle as predators, confident and sure. They left it wounded, shaken, diminished. The Americans entered uncertain, outnumbered, doubting. They left with a victory that would echo for generations. And so, the memory of Midway is not simply the memory of ships and aircraft, but of the men who could not be replaced. For Japan, the loss of those men meant the loss of the war's initiative, the loss of any hope of dominating the Pacific. For America, their own losses meant sacrifice, but sacrifice that opened the path to ultimate victory. In the quiet of the ocean, where waves roll endlessly and the sun sets in golden silence, the wrecks of carriers still rest, silent tombs for the men who never returned. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, and the Yorktown all lie beneath the sea, their decks silent, their guns quiet, their stories preserved only in memory. Above them, the Pacific continues its eternal rhythm, vast and indifferent, yet carrying within its depths the echoes of a battle that changed the world. The smoke from the Battle of Midway had barely drifted away when a new reality settled over the Pacific. For the first time since December of 1941, the United States and its weary allies could look across the wide ocean and believe, with quiet confidence, that the tide of war might be turning. The Japanese had begun the war with fire and fury, striking at Pearl Harbor, sweeping through the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and New Guinea with relentless speed. Each week had seemed to bring news of another stronghold falling, another Allied fleet scattered, another coastline swallowed by the ever-expanding Japanese empire. But now, in the early summer of 1942, the seemingly unstoppable advance had been checked. Midway had cost Japan 4 of its finest carriers, hundreds of planes, and, perhaps most devastating of all, irreplaceable air crews. The Japanese Navy, once considered the most fearsome in the world, was suddenly a wounded giant, still strong, still formidable, but no longer invincible. America, though still rebuilding from Pearl Harbor and scarred by the loss of the carrier Yorktown, had proven its resilience. The question now was simple but profound. Would the United States cling to defense, or would it seize the moment to strike back? In Washington and Pearl Harbor, the decision came quickly. President Franklin Roosevelt and Admiral Chester Nimitz both understood that Midway was not an end in itself but an opening. If America waited too long, Japan might regroup, refit, and reassert its dominance. But if America moved swiftly, it might capitalize on Japanese weakness, cut into their overstretched supply lines, and seize the initiative in the Pacific. And so, even as sailors mourned the loss of Yorktown, and even as the debris of battle still floated upon the waves near Midway Atoll, a new campaign was being planned. The target would be a small, little-known island in the Solomon chain. Its name was Guadalcanal. For Japan, Guadalcanal was part of its vast defensive perimeter. There, in the summer of 1942, construction crews and soldiers were building an airfield. From that strip of coral and jungle, Japanese bombers could threaten supply routes between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. If the Japanese completed their work, the Allies might find the lifeline to the South Pacific cut, and the entire region placed under Japanese threat. The Americans, guided by codebreakers and reconnaissance flights, knew of this development. To Admiral Ernest King, the aggressive chief of naval operations, and to Nimitz in Pearl Harbor, the message was clear. Japan must not be allowed to finish the airfield. The United States, with its industrial strength awakening, would move from defense to offense. The decision was audacious. Less than 8 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy would launch its first amphibious assault of the war. Marines would land on a hostile shore. Carriers and cruisers would provide cover. And for the first time, American forces would attempt to roll back the Japanese Empire. The plan was hurried, improvised, and far from flawless. Many commanders believed it was too soon, that the risks were too great. American forces were still learning the lessons of modern war. Training was incomplete. Equipment was short. Logistics untested. Yet Roosevelt and King pushed forward, believing that boldness was the key to seizing momentum. In early August 1942, the operation began. American transports, escorted by warships, sailed into the waters around Guadalcanal. The Marines, hardened but untested in large-scale battle, clambered down landing nets into Higgins boats and began their assault. To their relief, resistance was lighter than feared. The Japanese construction crews and their small garrison melted into the jungle, leaving behind bulldozers, supplies, and the half-finished airfield. By nightfall, the Marines controlled the strip of land. The airfield would soon be completed by American engineers and renamed Henderson Field. From it, American fighters and bombers would rise to challenge Japanese supply convoys, striking ships and aircraft that dared to approach. Guadalcanal, once obscure, became the most important patch of earth in the Pacific. Whoever held it would command the seas and skies of the southern Solomon Islands. Japan could not let it go unchallenged. For months, a brutal struggle unfolded, a contest of endurance, skill, and sacrifice. Japanese cruisers and destroyers clashed with American warships in night battles lit by fire and shell. Reinforcements were rushed by both sides, each determined not to yield. Marines on Guadalcanal endured shellfire, bombing raids, tropical disease, and the constant pressure of Japanese attacks. Supplies ran low, food became scarce, and water grew precious. Yet they held on. Out at sea, American carriers bore the burden once again. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, and later at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, Enterprise and Hornet fought desperately against Japanese forces. Hornet was lost, Enterprise was battered, but the Japanese, unable to replace their pilots, bled more heavily each time. Every American loss could be rebuilt by the shipyards of California and New York. Every Japanese loss, by contrast, weakened their fleet beyond repair. The struggle for Guadalcanal dragged on into the winter. By February of 1943, the Japanese conceded the island. Their troops, exhausted, starving, and decimated, were evacuated under cover of darkness. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan had lost ground, and the initiative belonged to the United States. Yet Guadalcanal was more than a battle for a single island. It was a turning point in psychology and strategy. For months, American sailors and Marines had proven that they could not only stand against the Japanese but drive them back. They had shown endurance under conditions as harsh as any in history. And the Japanese Navy, bloodied at Midway and drained at Guadalcanal, could never again launch a major offensive of equal scale. From Guadalcanal forward, the war in the Pacific would follow a new rhythm. America would advance, island by island, base by base, across the vast distances of ocean. The strategy of island hopping would be born. bypassing heavily defended strongholds, isolating them, and moving on toward the next stepping stone that led toward Japan. The victory at Midway had cracked the armor of Japanese power. The campaign at Guadalcanal had wrenched the sword from their hands, and together, these battles marked the shift of momentum. The Japanese Empire, once surging outward with unstoppable force, was now on the defensive. The Americans, drawing strength from their industrial might, their people's determination, and the memory of Pearl Harbor, were seizing the initiative. In the months to come, this initiative would become a tidal wave. New carriers slid from American shipyards. New divisions were trained, armed, and sent across the seas. Bombers were built in numbers that dwarfed anything Japan could imagine. And with every convoy that crossed the Pacific, the balance tipped further. For those who had survived Midway and Guadalcanal, the knowledge was profound. The war was far from over. Many battles lay ahead. Tarawa, the Marshalls, the Marianas, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But they had glimpsed the future. The Japanese Empire could be beaten. The long road to Tokyo had begun. The ocean, so vast, had once seemed dominated by Japan. Now, with the echoes of Midway and the sacrifices of Guadalcanal, it became the highway of America's advance. The initiative, once firmly in Japanese hands, had passed into American control, and from that moment onward, the tide of history flowed in only one direction. The Battle of Midway was remembered as the turning point. The Guadalcanal campaign became the proof. Together, they signaled to the world that the Pacific War, which had begun with shock and despair, would end in Allied victory. And for the sailors and Marines who had fought through those months of blood and toil, the memory remained, carried with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen the moment when the tide turned, when the United States seized the initiative, and when the path to victory began. When the waves of the Pacific calmed again, when the fires of Midway had burned themselves out, and when the wrecks of ships and aircraft had sunk beneath the surface, leaving only oil slicks and drifting debris, the battle gave way to silence. But in that silence, lessons emerged, lessons that would shape the rest of the war, lessons that commanders on both sides would ponder for months and years to come. Midway was not merely a clash of fleets. It was a revelation. It revealed the power of intelligence, the fragility of carriers, the skill of aviators, the courage of ordinary sailors, and the balance of luck and preparation that so often determines the outcome of war. To understand why Midway was the turning point, one must understand the lessons it offered to those who fought and those who watched from afar. The first lesson was the value of intelligence. At Pearl Harbor, the Americans had been taken by surprise, their fleet caught unready, their aircraft destroyed on the ground. But at Midway, the tables were turned. Thanks to the cryptanalysts of Station Hypo in Hawaii, thanks to the quiet brilliance of Commander Joseph Rochefort and his code-breaking team, the Americans had known in advance where the Japanese would strike. They had even tricked their enemy into confirming it, sending out a false message about Midway's water supply that revealed the target hidden behind Japanese code words. Without that intelligence, the American carriers might have been caught off guard, ambushed by Nagumo's fleet, struck before they could launch their own planes. Instead, they were waiting, ready, lying in silence northeast of Midway like hunters in the grass. Intelligence had turned the battlefield upside down. It had allowed Nimitz to gamble with confidence, Spruance to strike at the critical moment, and dive bombers to fall from the clouds when the Japanese decks were most vulnerable. Every admiral, every politician, every staff officer who studied Midway afterward understood the lesson. Wars are not won only on battlefields. They are also won in radio shacks, in code rooms, in the quiet corners where analysts sift through fragments of messages and piece together the shape of an enemy's plan. Midway proved that information, properly used, could be more powerful than guns or armor. The second lesson was the dominance of the aircraft carrier. For centuries, battles at sea had been decided by cannons, by the broadsides of battleships, by the clash of heavy guns and armored hulls. At Midway, The great battleships of Japan, Yamato among them, never fired a shot in anger. They sailed miles behind, powerful but irrelevant, while the carriers decided the outcome. The carriers launched aircraft, and the aircraft struck across hundreds of miles. Ships never saw each other, but they died just the same. Midway confirmed what Pearl Harbor had foreshadowed. The battleship was no longer the queen of naval warfare. The carrier, with its deck of planes, its squadrons of fighters, bombers, and torpedo craft, was now the decisive weapon. The navies of the world took note. After Midway, resources that might once have gone to battleships now flowed into carriers. For the Americans, it was an easy transition, for their shipyards could produce carriers in abundance. For the Japanese, who had lost 4 in a single battle, it was a lesson learned too late. The third lesson was about vulnerability. The Japanese carriers had not lacked skill, nor courage, nor striking power, but they had been caught at their weakest moment. Decks crowded with planes, bombs and torpedoes stacked beside aircraft, fuel lines running, hangars full of machinery. In those minutes of rearming and refueling, they were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. When the American dive bombers appeared from the sky, the spark became a firestorm. Every navy thereafter studied the lesson. Damage control became a science. Safety procedures were revised. Firefighting drills intensified. Ships were built with better protection, better bulkheads, better systems for pumping fuel and arming planes. But the truth was simple and sobering. Carriers were immensely powerful, but also immensely fragile. A few well-placed bombs could end them. The fate of Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu testified to that truth. The fourth lesson was about aircrew. The Japanese had begun the war with some of the finest pilots in the world. Their training had been rigorous, their standards high. They were professionals, veterans, masters of aerial combat. But Midway revealed a fatal flaw. Japan could not replace them quickly. When their carriers sank, their airmen went with them, trapped in cockpits or lost at sea. Hundreds of highly trained men were gone in a single day. The Americans, by contrast, had pilots less experienced, sometimes less skilled, but they had a training system that could produce thousands more. They had the industrial capacity to build planes in endless numbers, and the schools to train pilots by the hundreds every month. Midway underscored this imbalance. For every Japanese ace lost, there were few replacements. For every American lost, there were many ready to take his place. The lesson was not felt fully in June of 1942, but as the war stretched into 1943 and beyond, the difference became stark. The fifth lesson was about leadership and decision-making. Admiral Nagumo had been cautious, perhaps too cautious. When his planes returned from Midway and reported that the runways were still usable, he hesitated. He ordered a second strike, then delayed to recover planes, then delayed again when a scout reported an American carrier. His decks became crowded, his timing disrupted, his planes vulnerable. His hesitation, his need for certainty, cost him dearly. By contrast, Admiral Spruance, thrust into command unexpectedly after Admiral Fletcher was forced to transfer authority, acted decisively. He ordered his planes to strike as soon as the enemy was located, even at extreme range. He understood the moment and seized it, trusting his aviators to find the carriers and finish the job. His decisiveness, his willingness to act boldly, was rewarded. Midway proved that in the chaos of battle, hesitation can be fatal, while boldness, even at great risk, can bring victory. The sixth lesson was about luck. For all the intelligence, all the planning, all the courage, Midway still turned on moments of chance. The dive bombers from Enterprise had been searching fruitlessly, their fuel running low. By chance, they stumbled upon the Japanese carriers at exactly the moment when the decks were crowded with planes and fuel. Had they arrived an hour earlier, the carriers might have been ready. Had they arrived an hour later, the Japanese might have struck first. The timing was perfect, almost impossibly so. Luck had tilted the balance. This too was a lesson, that war is never entirely predictable, never entirely controllable. Commanders can prepare, can plan, can act wisely. But chance still plays its role. The lesson of Midway was to be ready when luck presented itself, to seize the opportunity when it came. Finally, there was a larger lesson, a strategic one. Midway showed that Japan's outward thrust had reached its limit. Its empire was stretched thin, its logistics overburdened, its resources strained. The dream of forcing America into negotiation, of securing a defensive perimeter too strong to break, had been shattered. America, with its vast resources, its industrial might, its determination, would not be cowed. The lesson was clear. Japan could win battles, but it could not win the war of attrition that lay ahead. For the Americans, the lessons became guiding principles. Intelligence would remain central, carriers would be built in numbers undreamed of, pilots would be trained relentlessly, damage control would be drilled into every sailor, boldness would be prized, and the long campaign to push across the Pacific, island by island, would begin with the knowledge that Japan had been beaten once and could be beaten again. For the Japanese, the lessons were harder, bitterer. They saw the cost of hesitation, the danger of fragile carriers, the irreplaceable loss of skilled pilots. Some understood that the war was already lost, though it would take 3 more years of blood to prove it. Midway, in the end, was not just a battle, it was a teacher. Its lessons echoed in every engagement that followed, from Guadalcanal to the Philippine Sea, from Leyte Gulf to Okinawa. It reminded commanders and sailors alike that victory is a mosaic of planning, courage, skill, and chance. And it reminded the world that even the mightiest fleet can fall, that even the most confident empire can be humbled in the span of a single day. As the waves rolled once more in quiet rhythm, as the Pacific resumed its endless motion, the lessons of Midway lingered. They lingered in the minds of survivors, in the logbooks of admirals, in the training manuals of navies, and they linger still, for those who study history, as warnings and reminders of the fragile, powerful balance that is war at sea. When the guns fell silent at Midway and the survivors sailed home, it was not just ships and aircraft that had been lost. Something deeper had shifted in the minds of sailors, in the councils of generals, in the conversations of civilians thousands of miles away. Wars are not fought only with weapons. They are also fought with morale, with belief, with the sense of who holds the initiative and who does not. Midway, more than perhaps any other single battle of the Second World War, changed those beliefs. Its psychological impact rippled far beyond the atoll itself, across the Pacific, across oceans, across the world. For Japan, the news of the battle struck like a thunderclap. Until that moment, the Empire's forces had seemed unstoppable. In only half a year, they had expanded across Asia and the Pacific, conquering territory after territory with alarming speed. Singapore had fallen, the Philippines had fallen. Burma was under assault, their navy had driven deep into the Indian Ocean. Their conquests gave the impression of inevitability, as though the rising sun would simply continue its climb, until it dominated half the globe. The Japanese people, told daily by their government that the empire was destined to rule, believed that their soldiers and sailors were invincible. The aura of superiority, of destiny, was part of the empire's strength. Even many Allied leaders, watching helplessly from London, Washington, or Canberra, feared that Japan might prove too strong to stop. The blow at Pearl Harbor had been stunning. The march across Asia had seemed relentless. But then came Midway. In just a few hours of concentrated fury, 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, the pride of their fleet, the backbone of their striking power, had been destroyed. Thousands of sailors and airmen had perished. These were not expendable auxiliaries or outposts. These were the best ships in the Imperial Navy, commanded by some of its most seasoned officers, crewed by some of its most skilled pilots. Their loss could not be hidden, nor could it be minimized. The psychological effect inside Japan was profound, though the government at first tried to soften the blow. Official announcements were vague. They spoke of heavy fighting, of setbacks, of ships damaged but not destroyed. Yet rumors spread quickly, carried by returning sailors, by whispers in naval towns, by the slow drip of truth that even censorship could not fully suppress. Families waiting for their sons, brothers, and fathers knew the silence that followed was the silence of death. Confidence began to waver. Where once there had been only triumph, now there was doubt. For the first time since the war had begun, the Japanese public confronted the possibility that their empire might not be invincible. That realization did not topple morale immediately. Loyalty to emperor and nation remained strong, and propaganda was relentless, but the seed had been planted. Midway was the first crack in the wall of certainty. For the officers of the Imperial Navy, the effect was even sharper. They understood what had been lost. They understood how difficult it would be to replace experienced air crews, how impossible it would be to build new carriers as fast as the Americans could. They knew that the balance of initiative had shifted. Though they still planned offensives, still fought hard in the Solomons and beyond, a quiet recognition crept in. The tide of war had begun to turn, and it might never turn back. For the United States, the psychological effect was the mirror image. Midway was a surge of hope, a sudden brightening of morale. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Americans had endured a string of bad news. They had seen their fleet crippled, their bases overrun, their allies driven back. There had been small successes, the Doolittle raid over Tokyo, a morale-boosting gesture, but no decisive victory. People at home had prepared for a long, grim struggle, filled with uncertainty. Then came the announcements. Midway had been a victory, not just a victory, but a stunning one. 4 enemy carriers sunk. A Japanese advance halted. For the first time since December 1941, the headlines were triumphant. Across the United States, the news electrified the public. Newspapers spoke of a turning point. Radio broadcasts carried the story into living rooms, factories, and farms. Families who had feared that the war might drag on endlessly now believed that the tide could be turned. It was more than just numbers, more than just ships sunk. It was the feeling that Japan could be beaten, that the terrible shadow cast by Pearl Harbor had begun to lift. Midway became a symbol, a reassurance that courage and sacrifice could prevail even against daunting odds. For those who had lost loved ones in the first desperate months of war, it was a comfort. For those preparing to serve, it was a rallying cry. Among the sailors and pilots who had fought, the psychological effect was personal and immediate. They had faced overwhelming danger. Many had seen their friends perish in burning planes, on sinking ships. They had endured chaos and fear, and yet they had emerged victorious. For the rest of their lives, many would remember Midway not only as a battle, but as proof of what they were capable of. It was a source of pride that steadied them in later struggles. From the Solomons to the Philippines to Okinawa, the psychological impact also spread to the broader Allied world. In Britain, where the struggle against Germany consumed attention, Midway was still a beacon of hope. It suggested that the Pacific would not be lost, that Japan's rampage could be checked. In Australia and New Zealand, where invasion seemed a looming threat, the news was a relief. Midway meant that the Japanese would be less likely to push further south. It gave time for defenses to be strengthened, for American reinforcements to arrive. Even among the Axis powers, Midway had an effect. In Berlin, leaders studied the battle with unease. Germany had relied on Japan to keep America tied down in the Pacific, to limit the resources that could be sent to Europe. The defeat at Midway suggested that American industry and spirit might not be so easily contained. It foreshadowed the eventual tide of men, ships, and planes that would sweep across both oceans. But perhaps the deepest psychological impact lay in what Midway symbolized, the sudden reversal of fortune. Wars are fought not only on maps, but in the minds of men. The Japanese had believed in their destiny. Midway shook that belief. The Americans had feared endless defeat. Midway replaced fear with confidence. In the span of a few days, The momentum of a global conflict shifted. And yet, the psychological story of Midway was not simple triumph and despair. For survivors on both sides, it was also trauma. Japanese sailors watched their carriers burn, their comrades trapped in flames, their fleet retreating. Many were scarred by what they had seen. Some felt shame, others felt rage. Some turned inward, silent for years, about their experiences. American survivors, too, carried heavy memories. The crews of Yorktown, forced to abandon their ship as it slipped beneath the waves, knew that victory had come at a cost. Pilots who returned to their carriers with empty seats beside them knew that friends would never return. The smell of burning fuel, the screams of wounded men, the sight of wreckage littering the sea, these impressions haunted them. Victory did not erase the pain, it simply gave it meaning. Over time, as historians, writers, and filmmakers told the story of Midway, the psychological impact grew even larger. The battle became not only a military turning point, but a symbol of resilience. It entered the mythology of the war, the tale of a smaller, battered fleet striking down a larger, confident enemy through intelligence, courage, and luck. For Americans, it became part of national memory, a reassurance that even in dark times, hope and determination can prevail. For the Japanese, it became a symbol, too, of hubris, of overreach, of the dangers of underestimating an enemy. The memory of Midway lingered as a cautionary tale, retold in naval circles long after the war was over. And for the world at large, the psychological impact of Midway was this. It marked the moment when the unstoppable seemed stoppable, when the tide of aggression met resistance, when the story of World War II shifted from conquest to counterattack. It reminded humanity of the fragility of power and the resilience of those who refuse to yield. In the years that followed, battles would rage across the Pacific at Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each had its own cost, its own lessons, its own memories, but all of them were fought in the shadow of Midway's psychological shift. The men who went into those later battles carried with them the belief that victory was possible, and the men who opposed them carried with them the memory of Midway's flames. The ocean at Midway is calm again. The coral reefs teem with life. Albatrosses wheel above the waves. The wrecks rest silently on the seabed, their crews long gone, their stories remembered. Yet the psychological impact endures. It lives in the histories written, in the families who remember, in the lessons still studied in naval academies. It lives in the simple truth that battles change not only the fate of nations but the hearts of people. Midway changed both. The waters around Midway slowly calmed after the wreckage of war. The smoke drifted away, and the great Japanese carriers slipped beneath the waves, leaving only oil slicks and scattered debris. The battle had been fought, and the world knew that it was a turning point. Yet though Midway was decisive, it was not the end of the Pacific War. It was, in truth, only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. The road ahead would stretch across thousands of miles, over countless islands, through jungles and reefs, and open seas. For the men who fought, it would be a road measured in sweat, exhaustion, and blood. Midway had given the Allies something they had desperately needed: time. For the first 6 months of the war, Japan had seemed unstoppable, sweeping aside resistance, building an empire that stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands. But at Midway, that forward momentum was checked. Japan's naval power had been blunted, its aura of invincibility shattered. The Americans had proven that they could not only resist but also strike back. Still, the task ahead was monumental. The Pacific was vast. It was a world of distances so great that maps often compressed them into neat squares, hiding the truth of just how far one island lay from another. Between Hawaii and Japan lay more than 4,000 miles of open ocean, studded with scattered chains of islands, each one potentially a fortress. each one a stepping stone toward the next. To win the war, the Allies would have to cross that ocean, one island at a time, carrying with them men, machines, fuel, food, and the will to keep fighting. Midway had slowed Japan, but it had not broken her. The Imperial Army still held vast territories on the Asian mainland. The Imperial Navy still commanded hundreds of ships. And though the carrier arm had been gravely wounded, Japan's fighting spirit was unbroken. Even as news of Midway reached Tokyo, the generals and admirals began to plan their next moves, determined to keep their empire intact. For the Americans, Midway was a victory that brought hope, but also responsibility. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his commanders knew that they could not simply defend. To win the war, they would have to go on the offensive. But where should they strike? How should they begin? The Pacific was a chessboard, and each move carried risk. The answer came sooner than many expected. In the Solomon Islands, only weeks after Midway, American intelligence revealed that the Japanese were building an airfield on a small island called Guadalcanal. The field, once completed, would threaten Allied supply lines between the United States and Australia. If Japan controlled Guadalcanal, it could cut off Australia, isolating a crucial ally and jeopardizing the entire Allied position in the South Pacific. The Americans moved quickly. In August 1942, Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal, seizing the half-completed airfield. It was the first major American offensive of the Pacific War, the first step on the long road ahead. What followed was 6 months of brutal fighting, on land, at sea, and in the air. The struggle for Guadalcanal was marked by ferocious night battles, desperate air raids, and grueling jungle combat. The Japanese fought with tenacity, launching wave after wave of attacks, but the Americans held on. At last, in February 1943, the Japanese evacuated the island. Guadalcanal was secure. The long road had begun. The victory at Guadalcanal proved that Midway was no fluke. The United States could now carry the fight into Japanese-held territory. But the cost was sobering. Thousands of men had died, and the campaign had stretched American resources to the limit. Supplies had been short, reinforcements delayed, ships and aircraft worn down by constant use. It was a reminder that this war would not be quick, and it would not be easy. From Guadalcanal, the Allied strategy took shape. It became known as island hopping. The idea was simple in theory, but complex in execution. Instead of attacking every Japanese stronghold, the Allies would leapfrog across the Pacific, seizing only the islands that were most useful as bases for the next advance. Strongholds could be bypassed and left to wither, cut off from supplies, their garrisons stranded. Each captured island would serve as a stepping stone, bringing the Allies closer to Japan itself. The island-hopping campaign demanded enormous logistical effort. Every landing required fleets of transports, carriers, battleships, and destroyers. Each island had to be supplied with food, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements. Engineers had to build airfields, hospitals, and docks. Pilots had to fly long missions over open sea. Sailors had to endure endless weeks at sea, facing storms, submarines, and sudden air attacks. Soldiers and Marines had to fight their way ashore under fire, then dig in against counterattacks. The road ahead was paved with sacrifice. Yet the Americans had one crucial advantage: industry. The same factories that had once built automobiles and refrigerators now turned out tanks, planes, and ships in astonishing numbers. While Japan struggled to replace the carriers lost at Midway, the United States launched new ones month after month. While Japan trained pilots slowly and carefully, America trained thousands, flooding the skies with fresh crews. While Japan rationed fuel and steel, America produced them in abundance. The long road ahead would be difficult, but the United States had the resources to walk it. As the campaigns moved forward from the Solomons to the Gilberts, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, the pattern repeated. Each island brought fierce resistance. Each victory brought the Allies closer to Japan. The names of those battles would become etched into history: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu. For the men who fought there, each was a world of hardship, fear, and courage. Behind each battle lay the memory of Midway. The knowledge that the Japanese could be beaten sustained morale through long months of fighting. Midway had been the first great turning point, and each victory after seemed to confirm that the tide of war had turned for good. Still, the Japanese never gave up easily. Every step forward was contested, every gain paid for in blood. For the Japanese people, the long road ahead was one of growing hardship. As the war dragged on, shortages became severe. The Japanese people, food grew scarce, fuel scarcer still. Bombing raids began to reach the home islands, and the reality of defeat loomed ever larger. But in 1942 and 1943, those dark days were still in the future. For now, the Empire continued to fight, determined to slow the American advance. The long road ahead was not only about geography, it was also about time. Years would pass before the final surrender. Thousands of lives would be lost. Families would wait anxiously for news of loved ones. Soldiers would endure the strain of combat. Sailors, the endless rolling of the sea. Airmen, the constant risk of sudden death. The war became not just a series of battles, but a test of endurance. And always, behind it all, lay the shadow of Midway. The battle had marked the turning of the tide, but the tide had a long way to flow. The Pacific was wide, the enemy determined, the challenges immense. Victory would come, but only after years of struggle. The long road ahead stretched across oceans and continents, through darkness and light, through pain and hope. It was a road that would end in Tokyo Bay, with surrender signed aboard a battleship. But in 1942 that end was still far away. For the men who had fought at Midway, and for those who would fight in the campaigns to come, it was enough to know that the road existed, that it led forward, and that step by step, island by island, mile by mile, they were on their way. And so, the Battle of Midway, though fought in only a few days, cast its shadow across years. It was the moment when the journey changed direction, when defeat gave way to the possibility of victory. But the road from Midway to victory was long indeed, and many more stories waited to be written on its course. The waves rolled gently across the Pacific, as if the ocean itself was finally resting after the fury it had unleashed. Beneath those waters lay the remains of proud ships, carriers that had once carried the hopes of an empire. Above them hung silence, broken only by the cries of seabirds and the eternal rhythm of the tide. The Battle of Midway was over, but its echoes carried far beyond those quiet seas. For in the aftermath of battle came reflection, and with reflection came lessons, lessons that would shape the course of the war, and even the future of warfare itself. For the Japanese, the lessons were bitter. Before Midway they had believed themselves unbeatable. Victory had seemed their birthright. In just 6 months, they had carved out a vast empire, stretching from the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Solomons. They had humbled the great powers of the West and seemed to stand on the edge of triumph. Yet at Midway, all that confidence had crumbled in a matter of hours. 4 carriers, the very heart of their striking force, were gone. Hundreds of irreplaceable planes and pilots were lost. The lesson was plain. Pride had clouded judgment, and overconfidence had paved the road to disaster. The Japanese plan for Midway had been bold, but it was also deeply flawed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the scheme, had hoped to lure the Americans into a trap. But the trap itself was too complicated, too scattered, too dependent on perfect timing. The Aleutian diversion in the north, the separate invasion forces, the delays in reconnaissance, all combined to create confusion rather than clarity. In battle, simplicity is strength, and complexity breeds weakness. This was one of the first lessons of Midway, that a plan, no matter how clever, must also be practical, and that in war, uncertainty is a constant companion. Another lesson lay in intelligence. The Americans had not stumbled into victory by chance. They had known where the Japanese would strike, and they had prepared. The code breakers of Station Hypo in Hawaii had cracked enough of Japan's naval ciphers to reveal the target. Their work had given Admiral Nimitz the advantage of foresight, the rarest and most valuable of gifts in war. Intelligence, Midway proved, was as decisive as guns or planes. Wars were not only won on battlefields, but also in dimly lit rooms where men pored over intercepted signals, piecing together meaning from fragments. In future conflicts, this truth would only grow more important. There was also the lesson of timing. For hours on June 4th, the outcome of Midway hung in a delicate balance. Japanese decks were crowded with planes being refueled and rearmed. The Americans had launched wave after wave of torpedo bombers, brave men flying obsolete machines into certain death. Their attacks had failed to score a single hit, yet they had drawn away the enemy's fighters, pulling them down to sea level. At that very moment, when the Japanese were most vulnerable, the American dive bombers appeared out of the Sunday. In just 5 minutes, they turned the battle. It was a reminder that in war, chance and timing can outweigh the plans of even the greatest commanders. The courage of individuals formed another lesson. The squadrons of torpedo bombers that perished almost to the last man had achieved nothing tangible. Their torpedoes missed, their planes burned, their crews were lost, yet their sacrifice was not in vain. By drawing enemy fighters away, they created the opening that others would exploit. Heroism often bears no immediate fruit, but it plants the seeds of victory nonetheless. At Midway, bravery bought time, and time bought triumph. For the United States, Midway confirmed the importance of the aircraft carrier. The age of the battleship, already in question after Pearl Harbor, was over. At Midway, the great battleships of both fleets played no part. The struggle was decided entirely by carriers and their planes. The carrier had become the capital ship of the age, a floating airfield that could project power across hundreds of miles. The world's navies would take note. From this moment forward, the carrier would reign supreme, reshaping naval warfare for generations to come. The Americans also learned the value of preparation. Yorktown, battered at Coral Sea, had been repaired in just 3 days, patched together by thousands of dockyard workers laboring without pause. She sailed into battle still wounded, her crew still weary, but she sailed nonetheless. Her presence made the difference. Without Yorktown, the Americans would have faced 4 Japanese carriers, with only 2 of their own. The lesson was clear: logistics, repair, and the will to squeeze every ounce of strength from resources could tip the scales. War was not only about the clash of arms, but also about the unseen efforts behind the front lines. For Japan, the loss of pilots was perhaps the gravest lesson of all. Carriers could be rebuilt, planes replaced, but experienced pilots were treasures that could not be easily recovered. At Midway, hundreds of veteran aviators were lost men who had trained for years, men who had flown at Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines, in the Indian Ocean. Their skill, their instincts, their knowledge of combat were irreplaceable. Japan's training system was in type, slow and selective, designed for peace, not total war. As the months wore on, fresh pilots would be rushed into battle with little preparation, facing Americans who now trained thousands at a time. Midway had opened a wound in Japan's air arm that would never fully heal. Strategically, Midway taught the Allies that the tide could indeed be turned. Until then, Japan had advanced without pause. Defeat had seemed inevitable, and morale was low. But Midway changed the narrative. It showed that with courage, intelligence, and determination, the enemy could be stopped. The psychological impact was enormous. In Washington, in London, in Canberra, leaders who had feared the worst now dared to hope. Among the American public, Midway was celebrated as a sign that the nation could prevail. For the men in uniform, it was proof that their sacrifices had meaning, that victory was not a dream, but a possibility. There were deeper lessons, too. Midway revealed the human side of war in stark relief. The young men who climbed into cockpits did not know if they would return. Many did not. Their letters, written the night before battle, spoke of love, of fear, of duty. They were not statistics, not mere units of strategy. but human beings caught in the storm of history. The lesson, perhaps the hardest of all, was that victory carried a cost paid in lives, in grief, in memories that haunted survivors long after the guns fell silent. Historians would later debate Midway endlessly. Was it truly the turning point of the Pacific War? Some argued that Japan had already stretched itself too thin, that American industry would have prevailed in the long run regardless. Others maintained that without Midway, Japan might have secured the initiative long enough to force a negotiated peace. But whatever the debates, the fact remained: Midway was the moment when the tide shifted. It was the battle that gave the Allies momentum, that began the long road back across the Pacific. Its lessons were written not only in history books, but in the lives of all who followed. In the quiet after the battle, survivors pondered their own lessons. Pilots who had returned from fiery skies spoke of luck, of chance, of the thin line between life and death. Sailors who had fought fires on the decks of burning ships recalled the teamwork, the discipline, the calm courage of their comrades. Marines on Midway Island, who had endured bombing and strafing, reflected on the strength of endurance. Each man carried his own lesson, his own story, his own memory of what Midway had meant. And beyond the war, Midway offered lessons for humanity itself. It showed the danger of arrogance, the power of preparation, the cost of underestimating an opponent. It revealed how fragile victory could be, how a single decision, a single delay, a single stroke of fortune could change everything. It reminded the world that war is not only fought with weapons, but with information, with organization, with resolve. And it whispered a truth that many would forget in later years: that peace, once lost, is fragile, and that the price of regaining it is immeasurable. The ocean around Midway holds these lessons still. Beneath the waves lie silent carriers, their steel twisted by fire, their decks home now to coral and fish. They are graveyards, but also teachers. They remind us that battles are not abstractions, but moments of human struggle filled with courage, error, sacrifice, and chance. They remind us that history is shaped not only by grand strategy, but by the choices of individuals' choices, made in fear, in hope, in desperation. Midway's lessons are not confined to the past. They speak to the present, to the future, to every time when nations face crisis, when leaders weigh risk, when ordinary people are called to extraordinary tasks. They remind us that preparation matters, that intelligence matters, that humility matters. They remind us that victory is never inevitable, nor defeat final, but that in the crucible of struggle, the outcome is shaped by those who dare, those who endure, those who believe. And so, the lessons of Midway endure. They endure in naval academies, where young officers study the maps of 1942. They endure in the memorials that honor the dead. They endure in the stories told by veterans to their children and grandchildren. They endure in the quiet respect of those who visit Midway today, walking among the ruins, listening to the wind, feeling the weight of history. Midway was not only a battle, it was a teacher. Its lessons, hard-won and dearly bought, still echo across the seas. And as long as men and women remember, as long as nations reflect, as long as history is told, those lessons will remain. For the Battle of Midway was not just an event of the past. It was, and is, a message to the future. The guns had long fallen silent, and the smoke that once blackened the skies over Midway drifted away into the past. Yet the memory of that battle never vanished. Across the years and decades, it lived on in the stories told by survivors, in the books written by historians, in the quiet ceremonies held by families and nations who understood that what happened in June of 1942 shaped the course of the world. To speak of Midway is not only to recall a naval clash. It is to summon memory itself, to hold a moment of history in the present, and to feel its echo within us. For those who had fought there, memory was not abstract. It was vivid, painful, sometimes haunting. The pilots who climbed into cockpits that morning remembered the smell of aviation fuel, the vibrations of engines, the way the ocean below stretched endlessly into the horizon. They remembered the crackle of radios, the sudden flash of tracer fire, the burning wrecks of planes spiraling into the sea. Some remembered the terrible loneliness of being shot down, floating in the water, waiting for rescue that might never come. Others remembered the weight of silence when comrades failed to return. These memories lingered long after the war, carried in hearts that could never entirely leave that place behind. For sailors aboard the great carriers, memory was written in fire and steel. Men recalled the deafening roar of bombs, the shudder of a ship when torpedoes slammed into her hull, the frantic rush to fight fires, to save friends trapped below decks. They remembered the blinding heat, the smoke that choked the lungs, the desperate shouts echoing through corridors filled with flame. And they remembered, too, the quiet acts of courage. A comrade carrying a wounded man to safety, an officer refusing to leave his post, a ship's crew working side by side with calm determination even as their vessel burned beneath them. These memories were never erased, not even by the passage of decades. The Marines on Midway Island remembered their own ordeal. They recalled the screech of enemy aircraft diving overhead, the thunder of bombs exploding among the sand and coral, the anti-aircraft guns hammering until barrels glowed red. They remembered nights filled with tension, waiting for an invasion that never came. For them, Midway was not only a victory, but a crucible, a place where they discovered how much fear a man could feel, and how much courage he could summon to stand firm. Yet memory is not only individual, it is also collective. Nations remembered Midway. In the United States, news of the victory spread quickly in 1942, bringing a surge of hope at a time when the world seemed shadowed by defeat. For the American public, Midway became a symbol of resilience, of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It reminded families that their sacrifices, the rationing, the long hours in factories, the sons sent overseas were not in vain. Midway lived on in newspapers, in radio broadcasts, in speeches that framed it as a turning point in the war. It became a story that was told again and again, each telling reinforcing the sense that history had shifted on those distant seas. In Japan, memory was different, more complicated. For the Japanese people, Midway was not celebrated but mourned. The loss of 4 carriers and thousands of sailors and airmen was devastating, yet official reports softened the blow. Propaganda often masked the scale of the defeat, though whispers and rumors spread among families waiting for loved ones who would never return. For the commanders, Midway became a lesson etched into shame, a reminder of mistakes, of overconfidence, of a moment when the destiny of empire faltered. For many Japanese veterans, the memory of Midway was heavy, painful to recount, a scar that never fully healed. As years turned into decades, Midway passed into history, but memory kept it alive. Veterans wrote memoirs, often reluctantly, sometimes after years of silence. They described what they had seen, what they had lost, what they had endured. Some struggled with survivor's guilt, asking why they had lived when others had perished. Others spoke with pride, not of victory itself, but of the courage of men who had fought beside them. Their words carried memory forward, ensuring that new generations could understand what Midway had meant. Historians, too, shaped memory. They pored over documents, battle reports, coded messages, and personal letters. They debated the significance of Midway, its place in the larger narrative of the Second World War. Some called it the turning point. Others argued that it was only one of many battles that together shifted the tide. Yet all agreed that Midway mattered, that it was a moment of extraordinary consequence. Through books, lectures, and films, historians kept Midway alive in the public mind, ensuring that the battle was remembered not merely as a clash of ships and planes, but as a moment when human courage and chance intertwined to alter history. Memory also took shape in rituals of remembrance. Each year, ceremonies were held, wreaths cast into the sea, names of the fallen read aloud. On the anniversary of the battle, veterans gathered, their numbers shrinking with time, but their voices carrying the same reverence. Families came too, carrying photographs of fathers, brothers, grandfathers who had fought at Midway. For them, memory was personal, carried in stories passed down through generations. The act of remembrance became a way of keeping those men close, of honoring sacrifices that could never be repaid. Midway entered cultural memory as well. Films dramatized the battle, some striving for accuracy, others shaped by the needs of storytelling. Novels and documentaries sought to capture its essence, its drama, its meaning. In classrooms, students learned of Midway alongside Pearl Harbor and D-Day, the names of ships and commanders woven into the larger story of the war. Memory was thus carried not only by those who had lived it, but by millions who came to know it only through words and images. The island itself became a place of memory. Midway Atoll, once a fortress, then a battlefield, later transformed into a sanctuary. Rusting guns, bunkers, and runways bore silent witness to what had happened. Visitors walked among them, feeling history in the stones and sand. The island became a living memorial, where seabirds nested among relics of war, and coral grew upon the wrecks below. Nature reclaimed the battlefield, but the memory remained. Over time, Midway became more than a battle remembered. It became a symbol. It stood for resilience in dark times, for the capacity of ordinary men to achieve extraordinary things. It reminded the world of the cost of war and the price of freedom. It showed that history could turn in a single day, in a single moment of courage and chance. For Americans, it became part of national identity, a proof of strength in a moment of peril. For the Japanese, it was a reminder of limits, of the dangers of pride, of the fragility of even the mightiest plans. Memory, however, is never static. Each generation remembers differently. For those who lived through the war, Midway was immediate, visceral. For their children, it was a story told at dinner tables, a part of family history. For their grandchildren, it became history itself, something learned in books and films. Yet the act of remembering kept it alive, ensuring that Midway did not fade into the mists of forgotten battles. In recent years, divers have explored the wrecks lying beneath the waves. Cameras have shown the broken hulls of Japanese carriers, lying silent on the ocean floor. These images brought memory into the present with haunting clarity. To see the twisted steel, the shattered decks, is to remember anew the violence of that day and to honor the lives lost. The ocean holds Midway in its depths, but memory lifts it into the light. Ultimately, the memory of Midway is not only about strategy or history, it is about people. It is about the young pilot who kissed a photograph of his sweetheart before climbing into his plane. It is about the sailor who manned his gun until the end, though flames roared around him. It is about the mechanic who worked through the night to patch a crippled carrier so she could fight one more day. It is about those who died and those who lived to remember them. Each life was a thread in the tapestry of memory, and together they form the story of Midway. And so, Midway endures in memory, not only as a battle, but as a moment when the course of history turned, not only as a clash of fleets, but as a testament to courage, to sacrifice, to the enduring power of remembrance. The waves that roll over the atoll today are calm, but within them lies the echo of a great struggle. As long as men and women remember, as long as stories are told, as long as silence is broken by names spoken aloud, Midway will live on. It is more than history. It is memory itself, passed from one generation to the next, eternal as the sea. The story of the Battle of Midway has always been told as a clash of ships and planes, of admirals and decisions, of strategy and chance. But beneath all of that, at its very heart, the battle is remembered for something deeper, the courage of those who fought it. The carriers may have burned, the planes may have fallen from the sky, but the courage of men, fragile, human, resolute, was what shaped the outcome and gave Midway its enduring legacy. Courage in war is not a simple thing. It is not only the charge into danger, not only the dramatic acts of heroism that shine like lightning. Often, it is quieter, steadier, harder. It is the willingness to rise when fear presses down. It is the strength to keep going when all seems lost. At Midway, courage was everywhere, woven into the actions of thousands of men whose names history may never fully record. Think first of the young pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8, who climbed into their slow, outdated planes knowing the odds against them. They carried torpedoes that often failed to detonate, flew aircraft that could not match the speed or agility of Japanese fighters, and yet they pressed on. Squadron after squadron hurled themselves against the enemy carriers, flying straight into storms of Zero fighters and walls of anti-aircraft fire. They knew, even as they flew, that they might not return. And for most, that was the truth. Nearly every pilot of Torpedo Squadron 8 was killed. Yet their sacrifice drew the Japanese defenders down, clearing the skies for the dive bombers that would follow. Their courage became the hinge upon which victory turned. There was Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of his squadron. Shot down, he floated alone in the ocean, watching as the battle raged above him, the carriers burning in the distance. He was young, only 27, yet his courage lay not only in flying into danger, but in surviving, in bearing witness. For decades afterward, he carried the story of his fallen comrades, speaking their names, ensuring their sacrifice was not forgotten. His life became a living legacy of courage, reminding all who heard him that behind victory were men who had given everything. Courage was found, too, in the hands of the dive bomber pilots who, after long hours of searching the empty sea, made the fateful decision to push on just a little farther. Wade McCluskey, leading his squadron, could have turned back. Fuel was low, time was slipping away, yet he followed a hunch, tracing the wake of a lone destroyer across the water. That choice, guided by instinct and resolve, brought him and his men directly over the Japanese carriers at the perfect moment. They dove through clouds, through flak, through the desperate fire of defenders, and in minutes the might of the Japanese fleet was undone. McCluskey's courage was not reckless, but determined the quiet faith that pressing on, even when the path seemed uncertain, could make all the difference. On the decks of the carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, courage was measured in minutes and in tasks that seemed impossible. Damage control teams worked with calm precision as bombs tore through steel and fires raged in confined spaces. They knew that one mistake, one spark, could ignite fuel and destroy the ship, yet they stayed at their stations, sealing hatches, fighting flames, carrying wounded comrades. When Yorktown staggered under repeated strikes, her crew fought desperately to keep her alive. Even when the order came to abandon ship, many left with tears in their eyes, as though leaving a comrade behind. Their courage was not only in battle, but in loyalty to their ship, to each other, to the duty that bound them together. Midway also revealed the courage of those who never fired a shot. In dim, windowless rooms far from the ocean, codebreakers labored over intercepted messages. Their battle was fought with pencils, typewriters, and endless hours of concentration. They faced doubt, dismissal, and the enormous weight of responsibility. If they were wrong, men would die. If they were right, they could change the course of the war. Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo worked tirelessly. Their courage shone in persistence, in the willingness to challenge assumptions, in the faith that truth could be found in fragments of numbers and words. Their courage was quieter, less visible, but no less vital. Without it, Midway might have been a Japanese victory. The Marines on Midway Island also carried their share of courage. As bombs rained down and oil tanks exploded in fireballs, they held their ground. Many of their aircraft were outdated, yet they took off anyway, flying into skies filled with Zeros. On the ground, they manned guns against overwhelming odds, their hands blistered, their ears ringing, their hearts steady. They did not know if reinforcements would come, if the fleet would arrive in time. They fought with the courage of men who understood that they were the thin line between the enemy and the homeland. Courage at Midway was not confined to one side. Japanese sailors and pilots, too, displayed a fierce and tragic bravery. They flew into battle with skill and determination, many sacrificing their lives for their nation. On the decks of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, crews fought desperately to save their ships as bombs turned steel into fire. They labored in smoke-filled compartments, trying to contain blazes that could not be contained. Their courage was real, even as they fought for a cause that would end in defeat. In this, Midway reminds us that courage is universal, that even enemies can share the same human strength in the face of death. As the years passed, the legacy of this courage became clearer. Midway was not simply a battle won by tactics or luck, but by men who chose to act bravely despite fear. The lesson endured. Courage could take many forms: the willingness to fly into fire, the decision to follow a hunch, the steady hands, battling flames, the quiet work of decoding secrets. Each act, large or small, shaped the outcome. Together, they formed a mosaic of courage that turned the tide of the Pacific War. This legacy lived on in the generations that followed. Veterans of Midway carried it home, in memories shared with their children, in lessons spoken at kitchen tables, in silences that spoke even louder. They taught that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to face it. They taught that ordinary men, when called, can rise to do extraordinary things. They taught that courage, once shown, becomes a gift that endures beyond a single battle. The legacy of courage also reshaped the Navy itself. The lessons of Midway informed training, doctrine, and tradition. Damage control became a discipline, because men at Midway had shown how critical it was. Carrier tactics evolved, because courage had shown the potential of air power. Intelligence work gained new recognition, because the courage of codebreakers had proven decisive. In every way, Midway's courage lived on in the future of the fleet. For America, Midway became a symbol not only of victory, but of resilience. The story of men who faced overwhelming odds and prevailed inspired a nation at war. It reminded people that courage was not confined to battlefields. It was also in the mothers who worked long hours in factories, in the farmers who produced food under rationing, in the families who endured uncertainty with dignity. The courage of Midway was mirrored in the courage of a nation determined to see the war through. Today, when we speak of Midway, we often speak of strategy, of turning points, of history. But beneath all of that lies the deeper truth. Midway endures because it was a story of courage. It was the courage of young men flying into impossible odds. It was the courage of sailors fighting fire and steel. It was the courage of codebreakers laboring in silence. It was the courage of an island's defenders, of leaders making hard choices, of men on both sides who did their duty to the end. That is the legacy of Midway. Not only that it turned the tide of the war, but that it revealed the enduring strength of human courage, a strength that shines across the decades, inspiring those who come after, a strength that reminds us that even in the darkest of times, when fear presses heavy, courage can rise, and in rising, change the course of history. And so, when we remember Midway, we remember not only ships and planes, not only victories and losses. We remember courage, quiet, steady, human courage, a legacy that belongs not only to the men who fought, but to all who inherit the lessons of their resolve. It is a legacy that endures, as eternal as the sea, as timeless as memory itself. The Battle of Midway ended in June of 1942, but its story has lived on for generations. It was not merely a clash of carriers, or the destruction of ships, or the loss of thousands of lives. It became something larger, a moment that shifted the tide of a global war, a point where despair gave way to hope, and where history itself bent in a new direction. Midway has been remembered, retold, studied, and honored not only as a victory, but as a symbol of what human determination, skill, and chance can achieve when they converge in a single moment of time. In the years before Midway, the Pacific was a vast ocean of uncertainty. Japan's empire had grown with a speed and ferocity that stunned the world. One conquest followed another, and the imperial navy seemed untouchable, sweeping aside resistance and striking wherever it chose. For the United States, battered at Pearl Harbor and still mobilizing its strength, the war in the Pacific felt perilous. There were doubts about whether America could recover quickly enough, whether its ships and planes and men could stand against such an experienced foe. Then came Midway. In just a few days, 4 Japanese carriers, the very heart of their striking power, lay sunk. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed, thousands of skilled pilots and sailors lost. For Japan, it was a wound that would never fully heal. For America, it was a breath of life, a sign that the tide could be turned, that the Pacific was not lost. Midway did not end the war, but it changed its rhythm. From that point on, Japan would be on the defensive, and America, step by step, would begin its long march across the Pacific. But the place of Midway in history is not only measured in strategy and consequences, it is measured in memory. It is remembered because of the men who fought there, who endured fear and fire, who did their duty in the face of overwhelming odds. The story of Midway belongs to the pilots who dove through clouds to strike the enemy at the critical moment. It belongs to the torpedo crews who flew into almost certain death to protect their comrades. It belongs to the sailors who battled fires on the decks of carriers, who patched holes, who carried wounded friends to safety. It belongs to the codebreakers who labored in silence, far from the ocean, and yet whose work shaped the fate of fleets. Midway also belongs to those who did not return, the thousands of young men, American and Japanese alike, who gave their lives on the sea and in the sky. For them, Midway was not a turning point in history, but the end of all their histories. Their sacrifice lies at the heart of what Midway means, reminding us that victory always carries a price. In the decades since, Midway has been studied in classrooms and war colleges, dissected by historians and strategists. It is called the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when the initiative shifted. Yet, beyond the analysis, beyond the diagrams and timelines, there remains something that cannot be measured: the feeling of Midway. It is the sense of standing at the edge of disaster and finding hope. It is the sense of ordinary men achieving extraordinary things. It is the sense of history itself pivoting in the hands of those who were there. The legacy of Midway continues in the stories passed down, in the reunions of veterans, in the memorials built to honor the fallen. It continues in the lessons learned, that preparation matters, that intelligence can be decisive, that leadership requires courage, and that sometimes luck plays a role no one can control. Midway is remembered as proof that even when the odds seem impossible, determination and resolve can change the outcome. Today, the waters around Midway are calm. The island remains small, a dot in the vastness of the Pacific. The wrecks of ships lie silent on the ocean floor, visited only by currents and the passage of time. Yet the silence holds echoes. If one could listen closely, perhaps the faint hum of engines, the roar of bombs, the cries of men might still be heard in memory. Midway is quiet now, but its story is never silent. In the larger sweep of the Second World War, Midway stands as a reminder that moments matter. A handful of days can decide the fate of nations. Decisions made under pressure can ripple outward for generations. The courage of a few can inspire millions. Midway is one such moment, carved deeply into the story of the 20th century. And so, as we close this long journey through the story of Midway, we remember not only what was lost and what was won, but why it matters. Midway matters because it shows us the resilience of the human spirit, the weight of sacrifice, and the power of courage. It matters because it reminds us that history is not inevitable. that the course of events can change in an instant, shaped by choices, by chance, by determination. Midway's place in history is secure. It will always be remembered as the battle that turned the tide of the Pacific War, as the moment when America seized the initiative, as the proof that even in the darkest of times, hope can rise. But more than that, it will be remembered as the story of men young, scared, brave, determined, who stepped forward when they were needed most. Their story lives on, carried in memory, in history, in the quiet dignity of remembrance. The Battle of Midway is not only a chapter of war, but a chapter of humanity, and its echoes will continue, as long as we tell the story, as long as we remember, as long as we honor the legacy of those who gave everything on the waters of the Pacific. In June of 1942, D.